A young woman raised between walls of faith, far from everything that awakened the body. A reclusive millionaire, used to controlling everything except his own scars. And when desire emerges, there's no going back to the safe place they once called purity. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment telling us where you are listening from. In the forgotten village of Little Thornwick, nestled deep within the Yorkshire Dales where mist clung to ancient stone walls like whispered secrets, Emma Hartwell lived between shadows and silence. The village was the sort of place that time had abandoned somewhere between the Industrial Revolution and the modern world, where cobblestone paths were still slick with morning dew and the church bells rang the same melancholy tune they had for centuries. Here, among the weathered headstones and limestone cottages that seemed to lean into each other for warmth, Emma had grown up knowing nothing but restraint. She had been raised by her grandmother, Margaret Hartwell, a woman whose voice had been stolen by grief when the telegram arrived 40 years prior, informing her that her husband would not be returning from a war that had ended before Emma was even born. The old woman communicated through severe glances and the rustle of her black dress, which she wore like armor against a world that had taken too much from her. Their cottage sat at the edge of the village, where the moors began their endless stretch toward the horizon, and it was there that Emma learned that silence was safer than speaking, that stillness was holier than movement, and that desire was something to be buried as deep as the dead in the churchyard. The Sisters of St. Bridget had taken charge of Emma's education, 3 stern women who had dedicated their lives to God with the fervor of those who had never known any other love. Sister Catherine, Sister Mary, and Sister Agnes moved through the village like black-clad sentinels, their faces carved from years of prayer and denial. They taught Emma that her body was a temple to be preserved, that her thoughts should be pure as fresh snow, and that a woman's greatest virtue was her ability to remain untouched by the corruption of the world. In their small schoolroom behind the church, with its single window that looked out onto the graveyard, Emma learned arithmetic and scripture with equal measure, each lesson wrapped in warnings about the dangers that lurked beyond the village boundaries. Emma's days passed in a rhythm as predictable as the church bells. Morning prayers with her grandmother, lessons with the sisters, afternoons helping with the washing or tending to the small garden behind their cottage, where she grew herbs that her grandmother used for remedies the village doctor had long since given up trying to understand. Evenings were spent in silence, Emma reading from one of the 3 books they owned while her grandmother worked on her endless knitting, the needles clicking like a countdown to some unknown end. She had never known her parents. Her grandmother had told her only that her mother had died in childbirth and that her father had been a man from away, spoken with such disdain that Emma learned never to ask for more details. But sometimes, late at night when the wind howled across the moors and rattled their windows, Emma would catch her grandmother staring at her with an expression she couldn't read, part love, part fear, part something else entirely. As if Emma were both blessing and curse, wrapped in the same small frame. The outside world existed only in fragments for Emma. Occasionally, a delivery truck would rumble through the village, bringing supplies to the small shop that served their community of perhaps 60 souls. Sometimes tourists would wander into Little Thornwick by accident, drawn by promises of authentic English countryside, only to find a place so remote and melancholy that they rarely stayed longer than it took to buy a cup of tea and ask for directions back to the main road. Emma would watch them from behind the lace curtains of their cottage window. These people, from beyond the moors who seemed to carry light and color and noise with them like exotic spices. They fascinated and terrified her in equal measure, but it was the letters that truly reminded Emma that a world existed beyond the boundaries of her grandmother's silence and the sisters' sermons. Once a month, sometimes less, the postman would arrive with official-looking envelopes bearing stamps from London or Manchester, or places whose names Emma recognized from her geography lessons but could never quite imagine as real. These letters were always addressed to Margaret Hartwell, and they always made her grandmother's face turn the color of old parchment before she would disappear into her bedroom to read them in private. When she emerged, the letters would be gone, burned in the fireplace along with whatever secrets they contained. Emma turned 21 on a Tuesday in October, when the leaves on the oak tree outside their cottage had turned the color of dried blood, and the air carried the promise of winter. Her grandmother had made her a small cake with flour hoarded from their monthly shopping trip, and the sisters had presented her with a prayer book bound in black leather that felt cold to the touch. It should have been a celebration, but instead it felt like a funeral for the girl she had been, though Emma couldn't have said what she thought she was becoming. That night, after her grandmother had gone to bed with the precise routine she had followed for as long as Emma could remember, washing her face with cold water, braiding her grey hair and kneeling beside her bed for exactly 10 minutes of silent prayer, Emma found herself unable to sleep. The cottage felt smaller than usual, as if the walls were pressing in on her, and the familiar sounds of settling timber and wind through the eaves seemed to carry whispers she couldn't quite understand. She had been lying in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling where shadows danced in the moonlight, filtering through her thin curtains, when she heard the sound that would change everything. A motor car, its engine purring with the kind of refinement that spoke of money and power, was making its way up the narrow lane that led to their cottage. In Little Thornwick, where the loudest sound was usually the church bells or the occasional bleating of sheep, the approach of such a vehicle was as startling as a thunderclap. Emma slipped from her bed and crept to the window, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. Through the gap in her curtains, she could see headlights cutting through the darkness, growing larger and brighter as they approached. The car, sleek and black and utterly foreign to their world, came to a stop in front of their gate with the quiet efficiency of something expensive. For a long moment nothing happened. The engine idled almost silently, and Emma held her breath, wondering if perhaps the driver had simply made a wrong turn and would reverse back down the lane. Then the car door opened, and a man stepped out. Even in the darkness, Emma could see that he didn't belong to their world. He was tall and wore a long coat that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. His movements were deliberate, controlled, as he opened the gate and walked up their garden path with the confidence of someone who had never been told he wasn't welcome anywhere. When he reached their door, he paused, and Emma felt rather than saw him look up toward her window. She pulled back from the curtains, her heart hammering against her ribs, but not before she caught a glimpse of his face in the moonlight. Sharp cheekbones, dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold shadows even in the pale light. The knock, when it came, was soft but insistent, not the urgent rapping of someone in distress, but the measured rhythm of someone who expected to be answered, no matter the hour. Emma heard her grandmother's bedroom door open with its familiar creak, followed by the shuffle of slippers on floorboards. She pressed her ear to her own door, straining to hear the conversation that followed. Her grandmother's voice, unused for so long, came out as barely more than a whisper when she spoke through the door. "What do you want?" The man's voice was cultured, with the kind of accent that spoke of expensive schools and old money. "Mrs. Hartwell, my name is James Morrison. I'm a solicitor from London. I'm here regarding Emma Hartwell. She's sleeping. I'm afraid this cannot wait. Mrs. Hartwell, it concerns the estate of Alexander Ravencroft." The silence that followed was so complete that Emma wondered if time itself had stopped. Then she heard the sound of the door chain being removed, the turn of the key in the lock, and the creak of hinges as her grandmother opened the door to let the stranger into their world. Emma crept from her room and positioned herself at the top of the narrow staircase, where she could hear without being seen. Her grandmother had led the man into their small sitting room, where the dying embers of their evening fire cast flickering shadows on the walls. She could hear the rustle of papers, the opening of what sounded like a briefcase, and then the solicitor's voice, calm and professional as he delivered news that would shatter the careful quiet of their lives. "I regret to inform you that Mr. Alexander Ravencroft passed away 3 weeks ago," he began. "He was, as you know, a successful businessman, hotels primarily with properties throughout England and Europe. What you may not know is that he has left specific instructions regarding your granddaughter in his will." "Emma has nothing to do with him." Her grandmother's voice was stronger now, fueled by something that might have been fear or anger or both. "I'm afraid that's not entirely accurate, Mrs. Hartwell. According to the documents I have here, Mr. Ravencroft was Emma's biological father." The words hit Emma like a physical blow. She gripped the banister to keep from falling, her mind reeling as 21 years of carefully constructed truth crumbled around her. The father, who had been a man from away, spoken of with such contempt that she had learned not to. ask questions, had a name, Alexander Ravencroft. And apparently, he had been wealthy enough to have solicitors making midnight visits to Yorkshire cottages. He has left Emma a considerable inheritance, the solicitor continued. However, it comes with specific conditions that must be met before she can claim what is rightfully hers. What conditions? Her grandmother's voice was barely audible now. She must spend 30 days at Ravencroft Manor in the Lake District under the guardianship of Mr. Dorian Blackwood, who serves as the executor of the estate. Mr. Blackwood is Mr. Ravencroft's heir and business partner. Only after completing this period of residence can Emma claim her inheritance, which, I should mention, amounts to several £1,000,000. Emma felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Millions of pounds, more money than existed in their small world, more than she had ever imagined could belong to one person. And yet, the condition seemed almost sinister in its strangeness. 30 days with a stranger, in a place she had never heard of, under circumstances she couldn't begin to understand. She won't go, her grandmother said firmly. We don't need his money. We don't want it. I'm afraid that's not your decision to make, Mrs. Hartwell. Emma is of age, and according to Mr. Ravencroft's will, she must be informed of her inheritance and given the choice. The decision is hers alone. Emma found herself standing at the top of the stairs, her hand on the banister, before she had consciously decided to move. The floorboard beneath her foot creaked, and both voices in the sitting room fell silent. Her grandmother appeared in the doorway, her face pale as moonlight, her eyes wide with something that looked like panic. "Emma," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You should be sleeping." "I want to hear this," Emma said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. She descended the stairs slowly, each step taking her further from the girl she had been that morning, and closer to something else entirely. "I want to know about my father." The solicitor rose as she entered the room, a man of perhaps 50 with kind eyes and an expensive suit that looked out of place in their humble cottage. He extended his hand and Emma shook it, noting how soft his palm was compared to her grandmother's work-worn fingers. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I'm very sorry for your loss, though I understand you and your father never had the opportunity to meet." "No," Emma said, glancing at her grandmother, who had sunk into her chair as if the weight of secrets had finally become too much to bear. "I was told he was dead." "Your grandmother was protecting you," the solicitor said gently. "Mr. Ravencroft was a complicated man. He felt it was better for you to be raised away from his world, but he never stopped watching over you. The monthly payments to your grandmother, the arrangements for your education, all of that came from him." Emma felt pieces of her life rearranging themselves like a puzzle being solved. The mysterious letters, her grandmother's careful hoarding of money, the way the sisters had always seemed to have just enough funds to keep their small school running. Her father, this man she had never known, had been present in her life all along, a ghost pulling strings from a distance. "Tell me about the condition," Emma said, settling onto the sofa beside the solicitor. "About this Dorian Blackwood." The solicitor opened his briefcase and withdrew a leather portfolio tied with black ribbon. "Mr. Blackwood is 32 years old, unmarried, and has been Mr. Ravencroft's business partner for the past decade. He's known for being reclusive, intelligent certainly, and successful in his own right, but he prefers solitude to society. Ravencroft Manor has been his primary residence since your father's death." "Why does he want me there?" Emma asked, though something in her chest already knew the answer wouldn't be simple. "I'm not privy to Mr. Ravencroft's motivations," the solicitor said carefully, "but I suspect it has something to do with ensuring that you understand the world you'll be entering if you choose to claim your inheritance. Your father's business dealings were complex, and his wealth comes with responsibilities. Perhaps he felt that a period of adjustment would be beneficial." Emma looked at her grandmother, who sat staring into the dying fire as if she could see her future written in the embers. For the first time in her life, Emma felt the stirring of something that might have been anger. All these years of silence, of carefully maintained ignorance, of being kept like a pressed flower between the pages of a book. And all the while, her life had been shaped by the will of a man she had never known existed. "What if I refuse?" Emma asked. "Then the inheritance passes to a charity of Mr. Ravencroft's choosing, and you return to your life here," the solicitor said. But I should mention that your father was quite specific about his hopes for your future. He believed you deserved the chance to see beyond the boundaries of this place, to make choices based on knowledge rather than limitation. Emma stood and walked to the window, looking out at the lane where the solicitor's car waited like a black promise in the darkness. Beyond the gate, the moors stretched endlessly, familiar and confining as the walls of a prison she had never realized she was in. For 21 years, this had been her entire world. The cottage, the village, the careful routines that marked one day from another with the precision of a clock. But tonight, a door had opened. Not just to money, though the inheritance was staggering, but to possibility itself, to answers about the father she had never known, to experiences beyond the careful boundaries of her grandmother's fear, to life perhaps instead of mere existence. When would I need to leave? Emma asked, her breath fogging the cold window pane. Mr. Blackwood is expecting you tomorrow if you choose to accept, the solicitor said. A car will come for you at noon. Emma, no, her grandmother's voice cracked with desperation. You don't understand what you're risking. Some doors should never be opened. Emma turned from the window to face the two people who held her future between them, one offering escape, the other clinging to the safety of the cage. For a moment, she felt the weight of 21 years of caution, of lessons about virtue and restraint and the dangers that waited beyond their small world. But stronger than fear was curiosity, and stronger than caution was the sudden, fierce need to know who she might become if she were free to choose. I'll go, Emma said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. I need to know. The solicitor nodded and began gathering his papers. The car will collect you at noon. Bring whatever you feel you'll need for a month's stay. Mr. Blackwood will provide anything else required. After he left, Emma and her grandmother sat in silence beside the dying fire. The cottage felt different now, smaller and more fragile, as if the solicitor's visit had cracked its foundations. Emma could feel her grandmother's eyes on her, heavy with unspoken warnings and 21 years of love that had expressed itself through protection. He's not a good man, her grandmother finally whispered. Alexander wasn't good, and neither is the one who surrounds himself with shadows. I've heard stories, Emma, whispers that travel even to places like this. What kind of stories? Her grandmother shook her head, her fingers worrying at the hem of her black dress, the kind that keep mothers awake at night, praying for daughters they'll never see again. Emma reached across the space between their chairs and took her grandmother's cold hand in hers. I'll be careful, she said, but I can't spend my life being afraid of stories. I need to know who I am, who I might have been if things had been different. And if you don't like what you find, Emma considered this, watching the last of the fire's light dance across the familiar walls of the only home she had ever known. Then I'll come home, she said, and I'll know that this is where I belong. But if I don't go, I'll never know anything at all. Her grandmother squeezed her hand once briefly and then released it. They sat together until the fire died completely, leaving them in darkness that felt both ending and beginning, both familiar and strange. Tomorrow, Emma would leave Little Thornwick for the first time in her life. Tomorrow, she would begin to discover what lay beyond the moors, beyond the careful boundaries of her grandmother's love and fear. Tomorrow, she would meet Dorian Blackwood, and her life would begin in earnest. The morning arrived grey and cold, with mist rising from the moors like the breath of sleeping giants. Emma had not slept. She had spent the hours before dawn, sitting by her bedroom window, watching the familiar landscape that had contained her entire world for 21 years, trying to memorize the way the light changed as it moved across the fields she would leave behind. Her single suitcase, a battered leather case that had belonged to her grandfather, sat by her door, containing the few possessions that defined her existence, 3 dresses, all in shades of grey or brown that the sisters had deemed appropriate, her prayer book, a few personal items that held memories of her grandmother's rare moments of tenderness, and the small wooden cross that had hung above her bed since childhood. Her grandmother had risen before dawn as well, though she maintained the pretense of her morning routine with the mechanical precision of someone clinging to normalcy in the face of catastrophe. She prepared porridge in silence, her movements sharp and efficient, but Emma could see the tremor in her hands as she stirred the pot, the way her shoulders held themselves rigid against emotions she refused to name. They ate without speaking, the only sounds the tick of the mantel clock and the distant bleating of sheep on the moors. At 11:30, Emma heard the purr of an engine approaching up the lane. Through the window she could see a different car this time, not the solicitor's professional sedan, but something altogether more impressive. A Bentley, sleek and midnight blue with chrome that gleamed despite the overcast sky. It moved with the quiet authority of expensive machinery, and Emma felt her stomach clench with nervousness, and something else she couldn't quite name. This was real. This was happening. The driver who emerged was not what she had expected. Instead of a uniformed chauffeur, a woman stepped out of the car. Tall, elegant, with silver hair pulled back in a severe chignon and clothes that spoke of London sophistication. She moved with the kind of confidence that comes from never doubting one's place in the world. And when she knocked on their door, it was with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Miss Hartwell?" the woman said when Emma opened the door. "I'm Mrs. Catherine Ashford, Mr. Blackwood's housekeeper. I've come to escort you to Ravenscroft Manor." Emma nodded, unable to trust her voice, and turned to retrieve her suitcase. Her grandmother appeared in the doorway behind her, and for a moment, the three women stood in a tableau of departure that felt heavy with unspoken warnings and regrets. "Take care of yourself, child," her grandmother whispered, reaching out to touch Emma's cheek with fingers that felt like parchment. "Remember what I taught you about virtue and strength. Remember that you always have a home here." Emma kissed her grandmother's forehead, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and old wool that had comforted her through countless childhood nights. "I love you, grandmother. I'll write." Mrs. Ashford waited with the patient politeness of someone who understood the weight of such moments, but had no time for extended farewells. She took Emma's suitcase with efficient kindness and placed it in the boot of the Bentley, then held the passenger door open with the gesture of someone who had performed this ritual before. As the car pulled away from the cottage, Emma turned to watch through the rear window as her grandmother stood in the doorway, a small black figure against the grey stone of their home. The old woman raised her hand once, briefly, and then the mist swallowed her, and Emma was alone with her decision and the stranger who would deliver her to her destiny. The journey to the Lake District took 4 hours, and Mrs. Ashford proved to be an unexpected companion. She was perhaps 60, with the kind of composed demeanor that suggested she had seen enough of the world to be surprised by very little. As they drove through the changing landscape, from the familiar moors of Yorkshire, through the rolling hills of Lancashire, and finally into the dramatic fells of Cumbria, she answered Emma's tentative questions with the measured responses of someone who understood discretion but was not unkind. "How long have you worked for Mr. Blackwood?" Emma asked as they passed through a small market town where people moved about their daily business with the unhurried pace of those who had never felt the weight of extraordinary circumstances. 7 years, Mrs. Ashford replied, her eyes on the road ahead. "Since shortly after he inherited Ravenscroft Manor." "What is he like?" The question slipped out before Emma could stop herself, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks at her own boldness. Mrs. Ashford was quiet for so long that Emma wondered if she had overstepped some boundary of propriety. When she finally spoke, her words were carefully chosen. "Mr. Blackwood is a man of considerable intelligence and refinement. He values privacy and order. He has his routines, his preferences, and he expects them to be respected. But he is not unkind to those who serve him well." It was a diplomatic answer that revealed nothing while seeming to say everything, and Emma found herself more curious than reassured. She had expected a simple description, kind or cruel, easy or difficult to please, but Mrs. Ashford's careful neutrality suggested complexities that couldn't be reduced to simple terms. As they climbed into the hills of the Lake District, the landscape transformed around them. The gentle farmland gave way to dramatic fells crowned with clouds and lakes that reflected the pewter sky like mirrors of heaven. Emma had never seen water that wasn't contained in the small pond behind their church, or the stream that ran along the edge of their village. These lakes were vast, mysterious, their surfaces stirred by winds that carried scents of pine and heather, and something wilder that spoke of places where human feet rarely trod. "It's beautiful," Emma whispered, pressing her face to the window as they wound along a road that followed the shore of what Mrs. Ashford identified as Windermere. "Indeed," the housekeeper agreed, Mr. Blackwood chose this location carefully. He appreciates beauty, particularly when it comes with solitude. They turned off the main road onto a private lane marked only by a discreet sign that read, Ravencroft, Manor, private property. The lane wound upward through ancient oaks and towering pines, climbing toward what Emma could glimpse through the trees as a structure of considerable size and Gothic ambition. The closer they drew, the more imposing it became, until finally they emerged from the forest into a circular drive that fronted a manor house that seemed to have been built by someone who understood that beauty could be both magnificent and slightly terrifying. Ravencroft Manor was constructed of dark grey stone that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the afternoon light. It rose 3 stories, with towers at each corner that gave it the appearance of a castle that had been refined for more civilized purposes, but had never quite forgotten its defensive origins. Windows stretched tall and narrow, their mullioned glass dark from within, and ivy climbed the walls in patterns that suggested decades of careful cultivation. The entrance was framed by an arched doorway that could have accommodated a carriage, and above it, carved in the stone lintel, was a coat of arms featuring a raven with spread wings. The Ravencroft family crest, Mrs. Ashford explained, following Emma's gaze. Ravens for wisdom and memory. Rather appropriate, don't you think? Emma wasn't sure what she thought. The manor was undeniably beautiful, but it possessed a quality that made her feel small and somehow exposed, as if the very stones were studying her and finding her wanting. She had never seen a building designed to intimidate as much as to shelter, and she wondered what kind of man would choose to live in such splendid isolation. Mrs. Ashford parked the Bentley before the main entrance and retrieved Emma's suitcase from the boot. "Mr. Blackwood is expecting you in the library at 4 o'clock, she said, checking the gold watch pinned to her lapel. "That gives us time to show you to your room and allow you to refresh yourself after the journey." The interior of Ravencroft Manor was as impressive as its exterior, but in ways that Emma hadn't anticipated. Rather than the dark, oppressive atmosphere she might have expected from the Gothic architecture, the halls were filled with light that streamed through tall windows and reflected off polished wood floors. The walls were painted in warm colors, deep creams and soft grays that complemented rather than competed with the natural stone. Artwork hung throughout the corridors, not the gloomy portraits of stern ancestors that Emma had imagined, but landscapes and still lifes that brought color and life to the spaces. "Mr. Blackwood has excellent taste," Mrs. Ashford observed, noticing Emma's surprised examination of a particularly beautiful painting of the lake they had just passed. "He believes that beauty is essential to civilized living, even in, perhaps especially in, isolation." They climbed a grand staircase whose banister was carved with intricate patterns of leaves and flowers, and Emma found herself running her fingers along the smooth wood, marveling at the craftsmanship. Everything in the manor spoke of money, yes, but also of someone who understood quality and took pleasure in surrounding himself with beautiful things. "Your room," Mrs. Ashford said, opening a door halfway down a corridor lined with more artwork. "I think you'll find it comfortable." The room was more than comfortable. It was luxurious in ways that Emma had never imagined could apply to a bedroom. The walls were painted a soft blue-gray that reminded her of dawn skies, and the furniture was clearly antique, but perfectly maintained. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, its hangings in cream silk that caught the light from tall windows overlooking the manor's gardens. There was a writing desk, positioned to take advantage of the view, a comfortable reading chair beside a small fireplace, and a wardrobe that could have housed the clothing of a dozen women of Emma's modest means. "The bathroom is through that door," Mrs. Ashford indicated with a gesture. "Hot water is always available, and there are toiletries provided. Mr. Blackwood believes his guests should want for nothing." Emma set her battered suitcase on the bed, its shabby leather looking pathetically inadequate in these elegant surroundings. Mrs. Ashford seemed to understand her discomfort. "There are additional garments in the wardrobe," she said kindly. "Mr. Blackwood took the liberty of having some things prepared for your stay. He felt that you might appreciate having options appropriate to the social expectations of the house." Emma opened the wardrobe and found herself staring at clothes that represented more wealth than she had ever seen in one place. Dresses in silk and wool, in colors ranging from deep jewel tones to soft pastels, Day dresses, evening gowns and casual attire that spoke of quality and refinement. Shoes that looked as if they had been crafted by artists rather than mere cobblers. Undergarments in silk and lace that made her cheeks burn with embarrassment, and something else she didn't want to examine too closely. "He doesn't know me," Emma said, her voice small. "How could he know what would fit?" Mrs. Ashford's smile was enigmatic. "Mr. Blackwood is very thorough in his preparations. I believe you'll find everything quite suitable." Emma touched one of the dresses, a deep burgundy wool that felt like water between her fingers, and tried to imagine herself wearing such finery. In Little Thornwick, such a dress would have marked her as someone putting on airs, someone who had forgotten her place. Here it seemed different rules applied. "I should mention," Mrs. Ashford continued, "that while you are a guest at Ravenscroft Manor, there are certain expectations regarding dress and behavior. Mr. Blackwood values formality and proper presentation. Dinner is served at 8 o'clock sharp, and appropriate attire is required. Breakfast is available between 7 and 9, but lunch is taken only when requested. The library, drawing room and gardens are available for your use, but certain areas of the house are private and should not be entered without invitation." Emma nodded, though she felt overwhelmed by the complexity of a life that required so many rules simply to navigate a single day. In her grandmother's cottage there had been routines, yes, but they were based on necessity and tradition, not the elaborate social protocols of wealth and privilege. "What areas are private?" she asked. "Mr. Blackwood's study. His private apartments in the east wing and the cellars are off limits," Mrs. Ashford replied. "The tower rooms are also private, though I believe Mr. Blackwood may choose to show them to you himself if he deems it appropriate. And if I need something? If I have questions? There is a bell pulled beside your bed that will summon assistance. I am available during the day, and there is a night staff should you require anything after hours. Mr. Blackwood dines alone most evenings, but he may request your company on occasion. When he does, it would be considered discourteous to decline." Emma heard something in the housekeeper's tone that suggested layers of meaning she wasn't equipped to interpret. In her world, an invitation to dinner was a simple thing. Acceptance or polite refusal based on preference or circumstance. Here, apparently, such social interactions carried weight and significance that she didn't understand. "Mrs. Ashford," Emma said carefully, "what exactly does Mr. Blackwood expect from me during my stay here?" The older woman was quiet for a moment, and Emma had the impression that she was choosing her words with the same care a diplomat might use when navigating treacherous political waters. "Mr. Blackwood is a man who appreciates intelligent conversation and refined company," she said finally. "He has lived alone for some time, and I believe he is curious about the daughter of his late business partner. Beyond that, Miss Hartwell, I think it would be best if you allowed Mr. Blackwood to explain his expectations himself." It was another diplomatically evasive answer, and Emma found herself wondering what secrets lay beneath the surface of this elegant house and its mysterious master. But before she could formulate another question, Mrs. Ashford was checking her watch again. "It's nearly 4 o'clock, she said. "I suggest you change into something appropriate for meeting Mr. Blackwood. The burgundy dress would be quite suitable. I'll return in 15 minutes to escort you to the library." Alone in the beautiful room, Emma stared at herself in the mirror above the dressing table. Her reflection looked small and uncertain, her simple grey dress marking her as clearly out of place in these luxurious surroundings. She thought of her grandmother's warnings, of the fear that had lived in the old woman's eyes when she spoke of Alexander Ravenscroft and the man who surrounded himself with shadows. But she also thought of the 21 years she had spent in Little Thornwick, watching the world through windows she had never been allowed to open. Whatever Dorian Blackwood wanted from her, whatever games the wealthy and powerful played in houses like this, surely it couldn't be worse than the slow suffocation of a life without choices, without possibilities, without even the knowledge of what she might be refusing. She removed her travel-worn dress and slipped into the burgundy wool, marveling at the way it seemed to transform not just her appearance, but her posture, her very sense of herself. The mirror reflected a young woman she barely recognized, elegant, mysterious, someone who might belong in a house like Ravenscroft Manor. The dress fit perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her body, and Emma wondered again how Dorian Blackwood, could have known such intimate details about a woman he had never met. Mrs. Ashford returned precisely 15 minutes later, her approving nod suggesting that Emma had made the right choice. They descended the grand staircase together, and Emma found herself moving differently in the elegant dress, her steps more measured, her spine straighter. It was as if the clothes carried their own expectations and demanded that she rise to meet them. The library was located on the ground floor. Through a corridor lined with portraits of people whose elaborate clothing and stern expressions suggested they had been painted in centuries past, Mrs. Ashford paused before a set of double doors made of dark wood carved with more of the intricate patterns Emma had noticed throughout the house. "Mr. Blackwood will see you now," she said, and opened the doors without waiting for a response. The library was vast, its walls lined with books from floor to ceiling, accessible by means of rolling ladders that spoke of a collection built by serious readers, rather than mere decorators. Tall windows filled the space with the golden light of late afternoon, and a fire crackled in a fireplace large enough to heat Emma's entire cottage. Leather chairs were arranged in comfortable groupings, and reading tables were positioned to take advantage of the natural light, but it was the man standing beside one of the windows who commanded Emma's attention. Dorian. Blackwood was nothing like she had expected, and yet somehow exactly what she should have anticipated. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with the kind of lean build that suggested both strength and refinement. His hair was dark, almost black, and slightly longer than fashion typically dictated, giving him an appearance that was both distinguished and slightly unconventional. He wore a charcoal grey suit that had clearly been tailored specifically for his frame, and his white shirt was open at the collar in a way that suggested he was in his own home and had no need to observe the strictest formalities. But it was his face that made Emma's breath catch in her throat. He possessed the kind of masculine beauty that was almost unsettling in its perfection. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that were so dark they appeared almost black in the library's golden light. There was something in his expression that suggested intelligence and control, but also something else, a quality of watchfulness that made Emma feel as if he were studying her, with the attention of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. He didn't speak immediately when she entered, but continued to regard her with that unsettling intensity while she stood just inside the doorway. Uncertain whether she should advance further into the room or wait for some indication of his preferences. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with significance that Emma couldn't interpret. Finally, he moved away from the window with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in his own body and his own domain. When he spoke, his voice was deep, cultured, with the kind of accent that spoke of the finest education money could provide. "Emma Hartwell," he said, and her name sounded different in his mouth than it ever had before, more substantial, more significant. "You are exactly as I expected, and yet not at all what I anticipated." "I'm not sure I understand," Emma replied, proud that her voice remained steady, despite the way her pulse had accelerated at his approach. "Your father described you in his letters," Dorian said, moving to a sideboard where crystal decanters caught the light like captured amber. "But descriptions, however detailed, rarely capture the essence of a person. May I offer you something to drink? Tea? Something stronger?" "Tea would be lovely, thank you." He rang a small silver bell, and within moments a young woman in a crisp uniform appeared, with a tea service that had clearly been prepared in advance. Emma wondered how many such social rituals were orchestrated in this house. How many apparently spontaneous moments were actually the result of careful planning and precise timing. "Please, sit," Dorian said, indicating one of the leather chairs near the fireplace. "We have much to discuss." Emma settled into the chair, marveling at the way the leather seemed to embrace her, and accepted the delicate porcelain cup he offered. The tea was unlike anything she had ever tasted. Complex, fragrant, with layers of flavor that spoke of exotic origins and careful preparation. "Tell me about yourself." "Emma," Dorian said, taking the chair across from her, "what do you do with your days in Little Thornwick? What brings you pleasure? What do you dream about when you allow yourself to dream?" The questions were more personal than Emma had expected, and she found herself struggling to answer. How could she explain a life so small and constrained that dreams had seemed like dangerous luxuries? How could she describe days that passed in such careful routine that pleasure was measured in tiny increments, the warmth of sun through her window, the satisfaction of a garden well tended, the rare moments when her grandmother's face softened with something approaching contentment? "I help my grandmother with the house," she said finally. "I read, I tend our garden. The sisters at the church taught me to play the piano, though we don't have one at home. And what do you read? Darakinamai, scripture, mostly. We have a small collection of improving books, histories, moral tales, poetry by authors the sisters considered appropriate." Dorian's dark eyes seemed to glitter with something that might have been amusement. "And what would you read if you could choose anything in the world?" It was a question Emma had never been asked, and she found herself considering it with an intensity that surprised her. I think I would like to read about places I've never seen, about people who live differently than we do in Little Thornwick, about love perhaps, though I'm not sure I would know how to understand such books." "Love is not something one understands through reading," Dorian said, his voice dropping slightly in pitch. "It is something one experiences, learns through practice, and discovers through exploration." There was something in the way he said it that made Emma's skin warm, as if his words carried meanings beyond their surface content. She felt suddenly very aware of herself, of the way the burgundy dress clung to her figure, of the way the firelight played across her skin, of the fact that she was alone in this beautiful room, with a man who looked at her as if she was something rare and valuable that he was considering whether to acquire. "Your father worried that you had been sheltered, perhaps more than was strictly necessary," Dorian continued. "He felt that 30 days in different surroundings might help you discover aspects of yourself that have remained dormant." "What kind of aspects?" Emma asked, though she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to know the answer. Dorian rose from his chair and moved to one of the tall windows where the late afternoon light painted him in gold and shadow. "Tell me, Emma, what do you know about desire?" The question hit her like a physical blow, direct and unexpected, and utterly inappropriate by any standards she had been taught to recognize. She felt heat flood her cheeks, and struggled to find words that wouldn't betray her complete ignorance of such matters. That is, the sisters taught us that such things were not appropriate for unmarried women to consider," she managed. "The sisters," Dorian repeated, and there was definitely amusement in his voice now. "And what did they teach you about the difference between sinful desire and the natural longings of the human heart?" "They said there was no difference," Emma whispered. "They said that all such feelings were temptations to be resisted." Dorian turned from the window to face her fully, and Emma felt pinned by the intensity of his gaze. "And do you believe that, Emma? Do you believe that the capacity for passion that burns in every human soul is something to be ashamed of, something to be buried so deep that it withers and dies?" Emma stared at him, unable to form a response. No one had ever spoken to her of passion as if it were something natural, something that might be embraced rather than feared. In her world, such feelings were dangerous, sinful, the province of fallen women and weak-willed men who lacked the strength to resist temptation. But looking at Dorian Blackwood, listening to his voice speak of desire as if it were as natural as breathing, Emma felt something stirring inside her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the grate, and everything to do with the way he looked at her, as if she were beautiful, as if she were worthy of being desired. "I don't know what I believe," she said honestly. "So I've never been allowed to find out." Dorian smiled then, the first genuine expression of pleasure she had seen cross his features, and Emma felt her heart skip in response. "Then perhaps," he said, moving back toward her chair with that predatory grace she was beginning to recognize as characteristic, "your education can finally begin." That evening, Emma found herself facing her reflection in the mirror of her luxurious room, trying to understand the woman who stared back at her. The burgundy dress had been replaced with an evening gown that Mrs. Ashford had selected from the wardrobe, a creation in midnight blue silk that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. The neckline was more daring than anything Emma had ever worn, revealing the pale curve of her throat and the subtle line of her collarbones. Her hair, which she had always worn in a simple braid as the sisters demanded, had been arranged by Mrs. Ashford in a style that allowed tendrils to frame her face, while the rest was gathered in an elegant chignon that made her neck appear longer, more graceful. She hardly recognized herself. The young woman in the mirror looked sophisticated, mysterious, beautiful, in a way that Emma had never imagined she could be. But beneath the surface transformation, she could feel something deeper, changing, as if Dorian's words in the library had awakened parts of herself that had been sleeping so long she hadn't known they existed. "Your education can finally begin." The phrase had echoed in her mind throughout the afternoon and early evening, carrying implications that both thrilled and terrified her. What kind of education did he mean? What did he see when he looked at her with those dark, intense eyes that seemed to strip away all pretense and see directly into her soul? Mrs. Ashford had explained the dinner protocol with the same careful attention to detail she brought to everything else. Dinner was served precisely at 8 o'clock in the formal dining room. Emma was to present herself in the drawing room at 7:45, where Mr. Blackwood would offer her a drink before they proceeded to dine. Conversation during the meal was expected to be intelligent but not controversial, refined but not pretentious. Mr. Blackwood appreciated wit but despised silliness, valued honesty but expected discretion. As Emma made her way down the grand staircase, her silk skirts rustling against the stone steps, she felt as if she were walking into a story that someone else had written, one where she was expected to play a role she didn't understand. The drawing-room doors were open, spilling warm golden light into the corridor, and she could hear the soft strains of music coming from within. Not recorded music, but someone playing piano with skill and feeling. She paused in the doorway, transfixed by what she saw. Dorian sat at a magnificent grand piano, his long fingers moving across the keys with the fluidity of someone who had been trained from childhood. The piece he played was melancholy and beautiful, something she didn't recognize, but that seemed to speak of longing and loss in ways that words could never capture. He had changed from his afternoon attire into evening dress, a black dinner jacket that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean lines of his body. His white shirt was pristine, his black tie perfectly arranged, but there was something almost medieval about him as he played, as if he belonged to an earlier, more romantic age when men wrote poetry and fought duels and loved with a passion that could destroy them. He looked up as she entered, his hands never faltering on the keys, and Emma felt her breath catch at the intensity of his gaze. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they simply looked at each other across the beautiful room while the music wove around them like a spell. Then he brought the piece to a close with a final, lingering chord that seemed to hang in the air long after the sound had faded. "Chopin," he said, rising from the piano bench with that fluid grace she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "Nocturne in E-flat major. Do you know it?" "No," Emma admitted, moving into the room with steps that felt uncertain despite the elegance of her gown. "I've never heard anything so beautiful." "Beauty," Dorian said, moving to the sideboard where crystal decanters caught the light like liquid jewels, "is something I believe you've been denied far too long. What would you like to drink? I have an excellent sherry if you prefer something delicate, or perhaps champagne to celebrate your first evening at Ravencroft Manor." "Champagne sounds lovely," Emma said, though she had never tasted it and wasn't sure what to expect. Dorian opened a bottle with practiced ease, the cork emerging with a soft pop that seemed to punctuate the moment with celebration. The champagne he poured was pale gold and alive with bubbles that rose to the surface like tiny stars. When he handed her the flute, their fingers brushed for just an instant, and Emma felt a shock of sensation travel up her arm that had nothing to do with the coolness of the glass. "To new experiences," Dorian said, raising his own glass in a toast. "To new experiences," Emma echoed, touching her glass to his with a crystalline chime that seemed to seal some unspoken agreement between them. The champagne was unlike anything she had ever tasted, crisp and effervescent, with a complexity that seemed to bloom on her tongue. She felt the bubbles rise to her head almost immediately, creating a warm, floating sensation that made the room seem slightly surreal, as if she were moving through a beautiful dream. "Tell me about the music," Emma said, gesturing toward the piano. "Do you play often?" "Every evening," Dorian replied, settling into one of the drawing room's elegant chairs and indicating that she should take the one opposite. "Music is one of the few things that can quiet the restlessness that seems to be my constant companion. Do you play? A little. The sisters taught me hymns and simple pieces they considered appropriate, but I've never played anything like what you just performed. Would you like to? The question was casual, but something in his tone suggested it carried more weight than it appeared to. After dinner, perhaps you could show me what you've learned, and I could show you what you might learn, given proper instruction. There was something in the way he said proper instruction that made Emma's skin warm, as if the words carried meanings beyond their surface content. She was beginning to understand that with Dorian Blackwood, very little was as simple as it appeared. Every conversation seemed to contain layers of meaning. Every glance carried weight. Every casual comment hinted at depths she was only beginning to suspect existed. I would like that very much, she said. Surprised by her own boldness, Dorian smiled, and Emma felt her heart skip in response. Excellent. But first we dine. Mrs. Ashford has prepared something special for your first evening. The dining room was even more impressive than the library, with a table that could have seated 20 people, but had been set intimately for 2. Candles flickered in silver candelabra, casting dancing shadows on walls hung with paintings that seemed to glow in the warm light. The china was delicate porcelain painted with roses, the crystal gleamed like captured rainbows, and the silverware was heavy and perfectly polished. Dorian seated Emma with old-world courtesy, and she found herself intensely aware of his proximity as he pushed her chair in. The warmth that seemed to radiate from his body, the subtle scent of his cologne that reminded her of cedar and something darker, more mysterious. When he took his place across from her, the table seemed both too large and too small. Too large for intimate conversation, too small to contain the energy that seemed to crackle between them. The meal was a revelation. Emma had lived her entire life on simple food, prepared with economy rather than artistry. But the dinner Mrs. Ashford had prepared was a series of courses that seemed designed to introduce her palate to pleasures she had never imagined. A delicate soup that tasted of spring vegetables and herbs she couldn't identify. Fish prepared with a sauce that was both subtle and complex. Beef so tender it seemed to melt on her tongue, accompanied by vegetables that had been transformed into something approaching art. And throughout it all, Dorian talked. Not the careful, measured conversation that Emma had expected, but stories that revealed glimpses of a life so different from her own that it might have belonged to someone from another planet. He spoke of traveling through Europe, of art galleries in Paris and opera houses in Vienna, of business dealings that took him to cities whose names she had only seen on maps. But more than the exotic locations, it was the way he spoke that captivated her, with intelligence and wit, with passion for the beautiful things he had seen and done. Your father, Dorian said as they began the final course, a dessert that was as much sculpture as food, was a man of considerable sophistication, but he always regretted the narrow boundaries of his own youth. He was determined that you should have the opportunities he felt he had missed. What opportunities? Emma asked, emboldened by the champagne and the warmth of Dorian's attention. To see beauty and recognize it, to experience pleasure without shame, to understand that the world is vast and full of wonders that most people never allow themselves to explore. His dark eyes seemed to search her face as he spoke, to discover who you might become if you were free to choose. And what if I choose wrong? The question slipped out before Emma could stop it, revealing fears she hadn't known she was harboring. There are no wrong choices, Dorian said, his voice dropping to something approaching intimacy. There are only choices that lead to growth, and choices that lead to stagnation. Choices that expand your understanding of yourself, and choices that keep you trapped in someone else's vision of who you should be. After dinner, they returned to the drawing room, where a fire had been built up and the piano waited like a patient teacher. Dorian poured brandy for himself and offered Emma a small glass of something he called Armagnac, which burned pleasantly as it went down and left her feeling even more detached from the careful constraints that had governed her life for 21 years. "Show me what you know," Dorian said, gesturing toward the piano. Emma sat at the bench with some trepidation, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on the keys. The instrument was far superior to the old upright piano at the church where she had learned, and even the simple hymn she chose to play sounded different, richer, more complex. But as she played, she became aware of Dorian moving behind her, and her concentration wavered. "You have good technical training," he said, his voice coming from very close behind her. "But you're playing the notes without feeling them. Music isn't mathematics, Emma. It's emotion given voice." He moved closer, and suddenly his hands were covering hers on the keys, his chest pressed lightly against her back, his breath warm against her ear. Emma's heart began to race, not from fear but from something else entirely, a sensation she had no name for, but that seemed to spread through her body like warm honey. "Feel the music," Dorian whispered, his hands guiding hers across the keys. "Don't think about what the sisters taught you about propriety and restraint. Think about what the notes want to say, what they need to express." Under his guidance, Emma found herself playing the same simple hymn, but it sounded completely different. Where before it had been precise and controlled, now it was fluid and expressive. Where before it had been technically correct, but emotionally distant, now it seemed to pulse with life and feeling. "Better," Dorian murmured, and Emma could feel the vibration of his voice against her back. "Much better. You have natural instincts, Emma. You simply need to learn to trust them." When the piece ended, neither of them moved for a moment that stretched into something charged with possibility. Emma could feel the warmth of Dorian's body against hers, could smell his cologne and something else, something purely masculine that made her pulse quicken in ways she didn't understand. She had never been so close to a man before, had never felt the solid strength of a male body, or experienced the way her own seemed to respond without her conscious permission. Then Dorian stepped back, and Emma immediately felt the loss of his warmth like a physical ache. "Perhaps that's enough for one evening," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "You've had a long day and tomorrow will begin your education in earnest." Emma turned on the piano bench to face him, trying to read his expression in the firelight. His face was carefully neutral, but she could see something in his dark eyes that suggested he was not as unaffected by their proximity as he was pretending to be. "What kind of education?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Dorian studied her for a long moment, and Emma had the impression that he was making some kind of decision about her, about them, about what would happen during her remaining 29 days at Ravenscroft Manor. "The kind that will show you who you really are," he said finally. "The kind that will teach you to recognize your own desires and decide whether they're worth pursuing. The kind that will prepare you to make choices based on knowledge rather than fear." Emma felt her cheeks burn, but whether from embarrassment or anticipation she couldn't say. "And if I discover things about myself that I don't like? Things that the sisters would say are wrong?" Dorian moved closer again, not touching her but close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Then you'll have to decide whether the sisters' opinions matter more to you than your own happiness, whether their approval is worth a lifetime of denying who you really are." The question hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Emma felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of bonds she had carried so long she had forgotten they were there. For the first time in her life, someone was suggesting that her own desires might be valid, that her own happiness might be worth pursuing, that the careful restrictions that had governed her existence might not be divine commandments, but human constructions that could be questioned, challenged, even rejected. "I should say good night," Emma said, though she made no move to leave. "Yes," Dorian agreed, though he also remained exactly where he was. "Mrs. Ashford will have left a nightgown for you, and there are books in your room if you find yourself unable to sleep. Tomorrow after breakfast I thought we might walk in the gardens. The weather should be pleasant and there are things I'd like to show you." "What kind of things?" "Beautiful things," Dorian said simply. "Things that will help you understand why your father thought this month at Ravenscroft Manor was important." Emma nodded and rose from the piano bench, acutely conscious of the way the silk of her gown whispered against her legs as she moved. Dorian escorted her to the drawing-room door, and for a moment they stood together in the warm circle of light that spilled from the room into the darker corridor beyond. "Good night, Emma," Dorian said, and the way he spoke her name made it sound like something precious, something worth savoring. "Good night," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But instead of stepping away, Dorian reached out and touched her cheek with the tips of his fingers, the lightest possible contact, but one that sent shockwaves through Emma's entire body. His skin was warm and slightly rough, and the touch lasted only a moment before he withdrew his hand and stepped back. "Sweet dreams," he said. And then Emma was walking down the corridor toward the grand staircase, her legs unsteady and her heart racing with sensations she had no words for. In her room, Emma found that Mrs. Ashford had indeed left a nightgown, not the practical cotton shift that Emma was accustomed to, but something in silk so fine it felt like water against her skin. As she prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and hardly recognized the woman who looked back at her. Her hair was mussed from where it had been pinned up, her cheeks were flushed with color, and her eyes seemed larger, brighter, as if something inside her had been lit that had never burned before. She thought about Dorian's hands covering hers on the piano keys, about the warmth of his body pressed against her back, about the way he had touched her cheek with such gentle reverence. The sisters had taught her that such thoughts were sinful, that a virtuous woman should banish them from her mind immediately. But lying in the luxurious bed, surrounded by silk and softness, Emma found that she didn't want to banish them. She wanted to examine them, to understand what they meant, to explore the feelings they awakened in her. She had been at Ravenscroft Manor for less than 12 hours, but already she felt as if she were becoming someone else, someone bolder, more curious, more alive. The careful constraints that had governed her life in Little Thornwick seemed suddenly arbitrary, like rules to a game she no longer wanted to play. But even as she embraced these new feelings, a part of her remained cautious. Dorian Blackwood was sophisticated, worldly, accustomed to getting what he wanted. She was naive, inexperienced, completely out of her depth in his world of wealth and refinement. What if his interest in her was merely amusement? What if this education he spoke of was simply another form of entertainment for a man who was bored with more conventional pleasures? And yet, when she remembered the way he had looked at her, not with the predatory hunger she might have expected from a man toying with an innocent, but with something that seemed almost like reverence, she found it difficult to maintain her suspicions. There had been something in his eyes when he touched her cheek, something vulnerable and almost wondering, as if he were as surprised by his reaction to her as she was by her reaction to him. Sleep was a long time coming, and when it finally arrived, it brought dreams filled with music and candlelight, with dark eyes and gentle hands, with whispered words that promised revelations she wasn't sure she was ready to understand. But even in her dreams, Emma found herself moving toward those promises rather than away from them, drawn by curiosity and something deeper, a hunger she was only beginning to recognize and acknowledge. The next morning brought sunshine and the kind of crisp air that made the Lake District famous. Emma woke feeling more rested than she had expected, given the tumultuous nature of her thoughts before sleep. Mrs. Ashford had left a day dress in soft green wool and walking boots that looked both practical and elegant, and Emma found herself looking forward to exploring the grounds of Ravenscroft Manor with an anticipation that surprised her. Breakfast was served in a smaller dining room that caught the morning light beautifully, and Emma was pleased to discover that she would not be eating alone. Dorian was already seated when she arrived, dressed in casual attire that somehow made him even more attractive than the formal evening wear had. His white shirt was open at the collar, his dark hair was slightly tousled, and he looked up from his newspaper with a smile that made Emma's pulse quicken. "Good morning," he said, rising to hold her chair with the same courtesy he had shown the night before. "I trust you slept well?" "Very well, thank you," Emma replied, though she felt heat rise in her cheeks as she remembered some of the more vivid aspects of her dreams. "Excellent. Mrs. Ashford has prepared quite a feast, as you can see." "I thought after breakfast we might take that walk I mentioned. There are several parts of the estate I think you'll find interesting." The breakfast was indeed a feast. Fresh fruit, warm scones with cream and jam, eggs prepared exactly as Emma liked them, though she hadn't specified her preferences, and tea that was even more exquisite than what she had been served the day before. As they ate, Dorian told her about the history of Ravenscroft Manor, how it had been built in the early 19th century by a man who had made his fortune in shipping and wanted a retreat from the pressures of London society. "He chose this location specifically for its isolation," Dorian explained. "He wanted somewhere he could live according to his own rules, pursue his own interests, without the constraints of social expectations." "What kind of interests?" Emma asked, intrigued despite herself. "Art primarily. Music, literature that was considered somewhat scandalous by the standards of his time. He collected beautiful things and beautiful people, and he created a world here where beauty was valued above respectability. There was something in the way Dorian spoke about the manor's original owner that made Emma wonder if he saw himself as continuing that tradition, creating a world apart from conventional society, where different rules applied and different values held sway. After breakfast, they walked out into gardens that took Emma's breath away. She had expected something formal and precisely maintained, but what she found instead was a landscape that seemed to blend seamlessly with the natural beauty of the Lake District. Paths wound through groves of ancient oaks and flowering shrubs, past ponds that reflected the sky like mirrors, through meadows where wildflowers bloomed in carefully orchestrated profusion. "It's magnificent," Emma breathed, pausing beside a fountain where water danced in the morning sunlight. "I'm glad you appreciate it," Dorian said, moving to stand beside her. "Your father helped design much of this. He had a gift for understanding how cultivated beauty could enhance rather than compete with natural splendor." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, following paths that revealed new vistas at every turn. Emma found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years, perhaps ever. The combination of beautiful surroundings, pleasant company, and freedom from the rigid expectations that had governed her life in Little Thornwick created a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. But it was when they reached a secluded grove where a small classical temple had been built beside a clear pool that Emma first sensed something darker beneath the surface beauty of Ravencroft Manor. The temple was beautiful, white, marble columns supporting a curved roof, with steps leading down to the water's edge. But carved into the stone above the entrance were words in Latin that Emma couldn't read, and something about the structure seemed to whisper of secrets, of purposes beyond mere decoration. "What is this place?" Emma asked, approaching the temple with a mixture of fascination and unease. "A folly," Dorian said, his voice carefully neutral. "The original owner had it built as a place for contemplation. The inscription is from Ovid, 'Love conquers all.'" But as Emma climbed the steps and looked into the shadowed interior of the temple, she saw something that made her breath catch. Carved into the floor was a pattern of roses and thorns, beautiful but somehow ominous, and in the center of the pattern was a single word in English: "Remember." "Remember what?" Emma asked, turning to find Dorian watching her with an expression she couldn't read. For a moment he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual, almost sad. "That some beautiful things come with a price. That not all desires should be pursued. That love, real love, can be both salvation and destruction." Emma felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. There was something in Dorian's tone, something in the way he looked at the temple, that suggested personal knowledge of whatever tragedy the structure commemorated. "Has someone else been here?" Emma asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Someone like me?" Dorian's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something raw and painful in their depths. "Yes," he said simply, "someone very much like you." "What happened to her?" "She learned that some educations come with a cost that's higher than the knowledge they provide." Dorian moved closer to Emma, close enough that she could see the pain that lived behind his carefully controlled expression. "She learned that love and obsession can sometimes wear the same face, and that not all teachers have their students' best interests at heart." Emma felt her heart begin to race, but not with the pleasant anticipation she had been experiencing. This was fear, cold and sharp and immediate. "And you?" she whispered. "Do you have my best interests at heart?" Dorian reached out and touched her cheek again, just as he had the night before, but this time his fingers trembled slightly against her skin. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely audible. "That's what terrifies me about you, Emma Hartwell. For the first time in my life, I don't know whether I'm the teacher or the student, the seducer or the seduced." The admission hung in the air between them like a challenge and a warning, and Emma felt herself standing at a crossroads that would determine not just the next 29 days, but the rest of her life. She could ask to leave, could return to the safety of Little Thornwick and her grandmother's careful protection, or she could stay and discover what lay beyond the boundaries of her sheltered existence, whatever the cost might be. Looking into Dorian's dark eyes, seeing the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide, Emma made her choice. "Then perhaps," she said, her voice stronger than she felt, "we can learn together." The days that followed Emma's choice in the Temple Grove passed in a haze of discovery that felt both exhilarating and dangerous. Each morning brought new revelations about herself, about desire, about the world that existed beyond the careful boundaries of her former life. Dorian proved to be a teacher, unlike any she had ever encountered, patient when she hesitated, encouraging when she struggled, and possessed of an intuitive understanding of exactly how far to push her toward new experiences without overwhelming her completely. He taught her to appreciate wine, beginning with sweet varieties that reminded her of summer fruit, and gradually introducing her to more complex flavors that required careful attention to understand. He showed her paintings in his private collection that made her cheeks burn with their frank depictions of human passion, then watched her face with dark eyes as she struggled to reconcile her body's involuntary response with everything she had been taught about propriety and shame. He played music for her that seemed to speak directly to the awakening, sensuality she was discovering within herself, pieces by composers whose names she had never heard but whose understanding of desire seemed to match the yearning that grew stronger within her each day. But it was there, conversations that proved most transformative. Over candle-lit dinners and long walks through the estate's gardens, Dorian drew her out with questions that forced her to examine beliefs she had never thought to question. Why should a woman's value be measured by her purity rather than her intelligence, her strength, her capacity for love? Why should desire be considered sinful when it was clearly a natural part of human experience? Why should she live according to rules created by people who had never known her, never cared about her happiness, never considered what she might want for herself? "The sisters who raised you," Dorian said one evening as they sat in the library after dinner, a fire crackling in the grate and brandy warming their blood. "What did they gain by teaching you to fear your own body, your own heart?" Emma considered the question, twirling the stem of her glass between her fingers as she thought. The past week had given her perspective on her upbringing that she had never possessed before, and the answers that came to her surprised her with their clarity. "Control," she said finally. "If I was afraid of my own desires, I would never act on them. I would never make choices they disapproved of, never leave their influence, never become someone they couldn't predict and manage." "And what did they lose by teaching you such fear?" "First it damned, they lost." "Eh?" Emma said, the realization hitting her with unexpected force. "They never knew who I really was because they were so busy shaping me into who they thought I should be." Dorian smiled, and the approval in his eyes warmed her more than the brandy. "Very good. And what do you think you might discover about yourself if you stopped being afraid?" It was a question that haunted Emma throughout the night and into the next day. She found herself studying her reflection in the mirror each morning, noting the changes that were becoming more apparent with each passing day. Her posture was straighter, more confident. Her eyes seemed brighter, more alive. Even her skin seemed to glow with an inner vitality that had never been there before. She was becoming someone new, someone she was beginning to like very much. But it was on her 8th day at Ravencroft Manor that Emma first encountered direct evidence of the mystery that Dorian had hinted at in the Temple Grove. She had been exploring the manor's extensive library, marveling at the thousands of volumes that ranged from ancient philosophy to modern poetry, when she discovered a section that seemed different from the rest. The books here were older, their leather bindings worn smooth by countless hands, and many bore titles in languages she couldn't read. It was while examining one of these mysterious volumes that a folded paper fell from between its pages. Emma picked it up, intending to simply replace it, but her name written in elegant handwriting across the fold stopped her cold. For Emma, the note read, "When she is ready to understand." With trembling fingers, Emma unfolded the paper and found herself reading what appeared to be a letter written in the same elegant hand. "My dearest, by now you will have begun to understand the nature of your education at Ravencroft Manor. You will have discovered aspects of yourself that your previous life kept carefully hidden, felt desires that you were taught to fear, experienced pleasures that you were told were sinful. This is as it should be. Every woman deserves to know her own power, her own capacity for passion. But I write this letter as a warning as well as a celebration. The man who teaches you these lessons is not evil, but he is dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with conventional morality. He will awaken parts of your soul that you never knew existed, and in doing so, he will make himself essential to your happiness in ways that can become destructive if you are not careful. I know this because I walked this path before you. My name was Amelia, and I was brought to Ravencroft Manor under circumstances very similar to your own. I too was sheltered, naive, hungry for experiences beyond the narrow boundaries of my upbringing. And I too fell under the spell of a man who saw potential in me that no one else had ever recognized. But love, when it becomes obsession, can destroy even as it transforms. Be careful, Emma. Learn what he has to teach you, but remember that you are the author of your own story. Do not let his vision of who you might become replace your own understanding of who you are. With love and hope for your happiness, Amelia Thornfield. Emma sank into one of the library's leather chairs, the letter trembling in her hands as she read it again, then a third time. Amelia. The woman Dorian had alluded to, the one who had been here before her, who had learned that some educations came with a price higher than the knowledge they provided. But this letter didn't read like the words of someone who had been destroyed by her experience at Ravencroft Manor. It read like the words of someone who had been transformed by it, who had gained wisdom and perspective even if the process had been painful. What does she mean? Emma whispered to the empty library. What happened to her? But even as she asked the question, she felt a chill of understanding. The temple with its warning about love and destruction. Dorian's admission that he didn't know whether he was teacher or student in their relationship. The careful way Mrs. Ashford spoke about her employer's expectations and preferences. Ravencroft Manor wasn't just a place where sheltered young women came to discover themselves. It was a place where they came to be claimed, possessed, transformed according to someone else's vision of what they should become. And yet, even knowing this, Emma found that she couldn't summon the fear that such knowledge should have inspired. Instead, she felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if she were finally approaching the heart of the mystery that had drawn her here. Whatever had happened to Amelia, whatever price she had paid for her education, she had survived it. More than survived, she had gained enough wisdom to warn the woman who would follow in her footsteps. That evening, Emma came to dinner wearing a dress she had never worn before, a creation in deep crimson silk that clung to her figure and left her shoulders bare except for thin straps that seemed designed more for decoration than support. She had chosen it deliberately, driven by a recklessness that was becoming more familiar with each passing day. If Dorian was dangerous, if their relationship was moving towards something that could transform or destroy her, then she wanted to meet that destiny, with her eyes open and her choices made freely. Dorian's reaction when she appeared in the drawing room was everything she could have hoped for. His usual composure slipped for just a moment, his dark eyes widening slightly as they took in her appearance before his expression settled back into its customary control. But she had seen enough to know that she affected him as much as he affected her, that whatever power he held over her was not entirely one-sided. "You look magnificent," he said, his voice rougher than usual as he moved to pour her champagne. "Thank you," Emma replied, accepting the glass with fingers that were steadier than they had any right to be. "I felt like celebrating." "Celebrating what?" Emma met his eyes over the rim of her champagne flute, feeling bold and beautiful, and more alive than she had ever felt in her life. "My education, the woman I'm becoming, the fact that for the first time in my life, I'm making choices based on what I want rather than what other people think I should want." Something flickered in Dorian's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or admiration, or something deeper and more complex. "And what is it that you want, Emma?" It was the question she had been asking herself for days, and suddenly she knew the answer with a clarity that both thrilled and terrified her. "I want to know everything," she said, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing. "I want to understand what it means to be a woman who isn't afraid of her own desires. I want to discover what lies beyond the boundaries of everything I've been taught to believe about myself. Even if the knowledge comes with a price." Emma thought of Amelia's letter, hidden now beneath the mattress in her room, and of the warning it contained. Even then, dinner passed in a haze of tension that seemed to thicken with each course. Their conversation was ostensibly normal, discussions of books, music, art. But underneath every exchange ran a current of awareness that made Emma's skin feel sensitized, as if the silk of her dress was a caress rather than mere fabric. Dorian's eyes never left her face for long, and she found herself studying the strong lines of his jaw, the elegant movement of his hands as he gestured, the way his voice seemed to wrap around her like velvet. When they retired to the drawing room after dinner, the atmosphere between them was charged with possibility. Dorian moved to the piano as he often did, but instead of sitting down to play, he simply stood beside it, his hands resting on the polished wood as he watched Emma settle into her usual chair. "Would you like me to play for you?" he asked. "Not tonight," Emma said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Tonight I would rather talk." "About what?" Emma took a sip of the brandy he had poured for her, letting the warmth spread through her chest before she spoke. "About Amelia." The change in Dorian's expression was immediate and dramatic. The careful control that he wore like armor seemed to crack, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. For a moment he looked like a man who had been struck, and Emma felt a stab of sympathy for the pain she could see in his eyes. "Where did you hear that name?" His voice was carefully modulated, but Emma could hear the tension beneath its surface calm. "I found a letter in the library. She left it for me, for whoever came after her." Emma set down her brandy glass and rose from her chair, moving toward Dorian with a confidence that felt both natural and strange. "She warned me about you." "Did she?" Dorian's laugh was bitter, self-deprecating. "And what did she say?" "That you're dangerous. Not evil, but dangerous. That you would awaken parts of my soul I never knew existed, and make yourself essential to my happiness in ways that could become destructive." Emma stopped directly in front of him, close enough to see the way his jaw was clenched with tension. She said love could become obsession, and that obsession could destroy even as it transformed. She was right. The admission seemed to cost him something, as if he were confessing to a crime he had tried to forget. About all of it. What happened to her? Dorian closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, Emma saw years of regret and self-recrimination in their depths. "I loved her. God help me. I loved her more than I had ever loved anything in my life. But I loved her the only way I knew how, completely, possessively, with a hunger that consumed everything else." "And she loved you too?" "Yes." The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "She loved me, and I destroyed that love by trying to own it instead of simply accepting it." Emma felt her heart ache for both of them, for Amelia, who had loved a man who couldn't love her properly, and for Dorian, who was clearly still tormented by his failure. "Where is she now?" "Gone. She left one night without a word, and I never saw her again. She took nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever money she could gather, and she disappeared as completely as if she had never existed." Dorian's hands clenched into fists on the piano's surface. "I spent months looking for her, hired investigators, followed every lead, but she had vanished. It was as if she had decided that erasure was the only way to escape what I had made of our love. And you blame yourself." "I am to blame." The words came out harsh, final. "I took a beautiful, innocent woman and tried to remake her in the image of my own desires. I convinced myself that I was educating her, liberating her from the constraints of her upbringing. But what I was really doing was claiming her, possessing her, making her dependent on my approval for her sense of self-worth." Emma studied his face, seeing the genuine pain and regret written in every line. This was not the controlled, sophisticated man who'd been teaching her about wine and art and music. This was someone raw and wounded, someone who had learned hard lessons about the difference between love and possession. "And now?" she asked softly. "What are you doing with me?" Dorian looked at her then, really looked at her, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I told myself that this time would be different, that I had learned from my mistakes. But from the moment you walked into this house, I've felt that same hunger awakening, that same need to claim and possess and transform. But I'm not Amelia." Emma moved closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I'm not the same woman she was, and this isn't the same situation, isn't it?" Dorian's voice was rough with something that might have been desperation. "You're young, innocent, isolated from everything familiar. You're dependent on me for your understanding of the world beyond your grandmother's cottage. How is that different? Emma reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the piano, feeling the tension in his muscles, the way his breath caught at her touch. Because I know about her. Because you've told me the truth instead of hiding it. Because I'm choosing this with my eyes open. You don't understand what you're choosing. Then show me. The words came out more boldly than Emma had intended, but she didn't take them back. Show me what it means to love the way you loved her. Show me what I'm risking. Dorian stared at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face as if he were trying to read the depths of her soul. Then, with a movement so sudden it made her gasp, he turned and pulled her against him, his hands framing her face as he looked down at her with an intensity that made her knees weak. You want to know what love means to a man like me? His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the force of thunder. It means I think about you every moment of every day. It means the sound of your voice is the only music I want to hear, and the sight of your face is the only beauty I need. It means I would burn this entire world to ash if it would keep you safe, and damn my soul to hell if it would make you happy. Emma felt her breath catch in her throat at the raw passion in his words, at the way his hands trembled slightly against her skin, despite the fierce control he maintained over his voice. It means, Dorian continued, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with reverent tenderness, that I want to know every thought in your head, every dream in your heart, every secret desire you've never dared to voice. I want to be the source of every pleasure you experience and the solution to every pain you feel. I want to remake you in the image of my love until there's no part of you that doesn't belong to me. And you think that's wrong? Emma whispered, her hands coming up to rest against his chest where she could feel the rapid beating of his heart. I think it's dangerous. I think it's the kind of love that consumes everything it touches. I think it's the kind of love that can destroy a woman's sense of herself if she's not strong enough to resist it. Emma looked up into his eyes, seeing the war being fought there between desire and conscience, between the need to possess and the need to protect. In that moment, she understood that Dorian Blackwood was not the sophisticated predator she might have expected. He was a man torn between his nature and his hard-won wisdom, between what he wanted and what he believed was right. What if I am strong enough? She asked, her voice steady despite the way her pulse was racing. What if I can love you back the same way, with the same intensity, without losing myself in the process? Emma? Her name came out as a groan, as if he were in physical pain. What if the mistake you made with Amelia wasn't loving her too much, but not trusting her enough? Not believing she was strong enough to be an equal partner in something so powerful? Dorian's hands tightened on her face, and for a moment Emma thought he might kiss her. Instead, he rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. You don't know what you're saying, he whispered. You don't know what you'd be taking on. Then teach me. Emma's hands slid up his chest to rest against his neck, her fingers threading through the dark hair at his nape. Not the way you taught Amelia, trying to mold me into what you think I should be. Teach me as an equal, as someone who can choose to love you back or choose to walk away. And if you choose to walk away, Emma smiled, feeling a confidence she had never possessed before flowing through her like wine. Then you'll let me go, because that's what real love does. It sets the beloved free to choose, even if the choice breaks your heart. For a long moment, they stood frozen in that tableau of possibility, balanced on the edge of a decision that would change everything. Emma could feel the war being fought in Dorian's mind, could see it reflected in the depths of his dark eyes. Fear warred with hope, control battled with surrender, and underneath it all was a love so powerful it seemed to pulse in, the air between them. Then, with infinite gentleness, Dorian lifted his hands from her face and stepped back. Not yet, he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Not until you've had time to truly understand what you're choosing. Not until you've seen all the parts of myself I've kept hidden from you. Emma felt a stab of disappointment so sharp it was almost physical pain, but she forced herself to nod, understanding. What parts? The parts that Amelia saw too late. The jealousy that can turn rational thought to madness. The possessiveness that can make a cage out of even the most beautiful palace. The need to control that can destroy the very thing it seeks to protect. Dorian moved away from her, putting distance between them, as if proximity made honesty impossible. Tomorrow I'll show you the rest of Ravencroft Manor. The parts Mrs. Ashford said were private. The parts where Amelia lived during her last months here. Why? Because you deserve to see what love looks like when it becomes obsession. You deserve to understand what you'd be risking if you choose to stay. If you choose to love a man who doesn't know how to love without trying to possess. Emma nodded, though every instinct in her body was screaming at her to close the distance between them, to finish what they had started, to damn the consequences and claim the love he was offering, even if it came wrapped in danger. And after I've seen everything? After I understand the full scope of the choice I'm making? Dorian's smile was sad and beautiful, and full of a longing that made her heart ache. Then you'll choose, and whatever you decide, I'll honor it, even if it destroys me. That night, Emma lay in her silk-draped bed staring at the ceiling, Amelia's letter clutched in her hands as she tried to process everything that had happened. In the space of a few hours, her understanding of her situation at Ravenscroft Manor had been completely transformed. What she had thought was a simple inheritance condition had revealed itself to be something far more complex, a test, perhaps, or a chance for redemption, or simply the working out of a pattern that had begun years before with another young woman who had faced the same choice Emma now confronted. But unlike Amelia, Emma would make her decision with full knowledge of the risks involved. Unlike Amelia, she would see the dark side of Dorian's love before she committed to it. And unlike Amelia, she would have the power to choose with her eyes wide open and her heart fully informed. The question was, what would she choose? As she finally drifted off to sleep, Emma found herself thinking not of the warnings in Amelia's letter, or the pain in Dorian's eyes when he spoke of his lost love, but of the way he had looked at her in those moments before he stepped away, as if she was something precious and powerful and dangerous, something that could save him or destroy him with equal ease. For the first time in her life, Emma understood what it meant to hold such power over another human being, and for the first time she began to understand why such power was both a gift and a terrible responsibility. Tomorrow she would see the rest of Ravenscroft Manor's secrets. Tomorrow she would learn the full truth about what had happened to Amelia and what it meant to love a man like Dorian Blackwood. And then she would choose. But even as sleep claimed her, Emma found that she already knew what her choice would be, not because she was naive or reckless or unaware of the risks, but because she had discovered something about herself during her time at Ravenscroft Manor that changed everything. She was not a woman who ran from danger when it came wrapped in love. She was a woman who ran toward it, arms open and heart ready, trusting in her own strength to weather whatever storms might come. The Emma Hartwell who had left Little Thornwick 9 days ago would have been terrified by the choice she now faced. But the woman she had become, the woman Dorian had helped her discover, was ready for it. She was ready for anything. The morning of Emma's 10th day at Ravenscroft Manor dawned grey and cold, with mist rising from the lake like the breath of sleeping ghosts. She woke with a sense of anticipation that was equal parts excitement and dread, knowing that today would bring the revelations Dorian had promised, the dark truths about Amelia's time at the manor, and the full scope of what loving him would mean. She had spent the night tossing restlessly between silk sheets, Amelia's letter pressed against her heart like a talisman, and when Mrs. Ashford knocked softly on her door with the morning tea service, Emma was already dressed and waiting. "Mr. Blackwood requests that you join him in the entrance hall at 10 o'clock, Mrs. Ashford said, as she set the delicate porcelain service on the table beside Emma's window. There was something different in the housekeeper's manner this morning, a carefully controlled tension that suggested she knew what the day would bring. "He asked me to tell you that you should wear something practical for walking, as you'll be covering considerable ground." Emma nodded, though she felt as if her voice might fail her if she tried to speak. The weight of what was coming pressed against her chest like a stone, and she found herself wondering if Amelia had felt this same mixture of fear and anticipation when Dorian had revealed his secrets to her. At precisely 10 o'clock, Emma descended the grand staircase to find Dorian waiting in the entrance hall. He was dressed casually in dark trousers and a white shirt open at the collar, but there was nothing relaxed about his posture. He stood with the rigid control of a man preparing for battle, and when he looked up at her approach, Emma saw shadows in his dark eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and painful memories. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, "As ready as I can be," Emma replied, proud that her voice remained steady, despite the way her heart was racing. Dorian nodded and gestured toward a corridor Emma had never explored, one that led away from the main living areas of the manor toward what she assumed were service areas or storage rooms. But as they walked, she realized that this part of the house was far more elaborate than she had expected. The walls were paneled in dark wood and hung with paintings that seemed older and more valuable than those in the public areas. The floors were covered with Persian rugs that must have cost more than her grandmother's cottage, and the furnishings, while sparse, were clearly antique and exquisite. "This is the East Wing," Dorian explained as they walked. "My private apartments are here, as well as other rooms that were important to the manor's history." They climbed a narrow staircase that Emma hadn't known existed, emerging onto a landing that was lit by tall windows overlooking the lake. The view was spectacular, but Emma barely noticed it. Her attention was caught by the door at the end of the hall, a door made of dark oak and fitted with hardware that looked medieval in its weight and complexity. "Amelia's rooms," Dorian said, following her gaze. "She lived here during the last 6 months of her time at Ravencroft Manor." Emma felt her breath catch. She had her own wing? She insisted on it. Dorian's voice was carefully controlled, but Emma could hear the pain beneath its surface. "As our relationship progressed, she began to feel confined by the arrangements I had initially made for her. She said she needed space that was entirely her own, somewhere she could think clearly without my influence." They approached the door, and Dorian withdrew a key from his pocket, an ornate thing that looked as ancient as the lock it was meant to open. His hand trembled slightly as he inserted it, and Emma felt a stab of sympathy for the memories this must be reviving. "I haven't been in these rooms since the night she left," Dorian said quietly. "Mrs. Ashford has maintained them, but I couldn't bear to see them again." The door opened with a whisper of well-oiled hinges, and Emma found herself looking into a sitting room that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. It was decorated in shades of cream and gold, with furniture that was elegant but comfortable, and windows that filled the space with light even on this grey morning. But what struck Emma most forcefully was how lived-in the room felt, how personal. Books lay open on side tables, as if their reader had just stepped away for a moment. A piece of embroidery sat in a basket beside one of the chairs, the needle still threaded as if waiting for work to resume. Fresh flowers, white roses and baby's breath, stood in a crystal vase on the mantelpiece. "Mrs. Ashford keeps them fresh," Dorian said, noticing Emma's surprised glance at the flowers. "She says Amelia loved white roses, and it seems wrong to let the room stand empty without some sign of life." Emma moved deeper into the sitting room, her fingers trailing over surfaces that seemed to hold the echo of another woman's presence. On a writing desk positioned to take advantage of the window's light, she found stacks of letters tied with ribbon, books of poetry marked with slips of paper, and a journal bound in soft leather that fell open at her touch to reveal pages covered with elegant handwriting. "May I?" Emma asked, gesturing toward the journal. Dorian nodded, though she could see the tension in his jaw. "She would have wanted you to read it. She always said that knowledge was meant to be shared, especially knowledge that might help someone else avoid the mistakes she made." Emma picked up the journal with reverent care and began to read. The entries were dated, beginning nearly 2 years earlier, and as Emma absorbed the words, she began to understand the progression of Amelia's relationship with Dorian in a way that his own account hadn't revealed. The early entries were filled with wonder and gratitude. Amelia wrote of her amazement at the luxury of Ravencroft Manor, her joy at discovering books and music and art that she had never known existed. She described Dorian as kind, patient, fascinating, a man who seemed to understand her in ways that no one ever had before. Emma recognized her own feelings in those early pages, the same sense of awakening and possibility that had characterized her first days at the manor. But as the entries progressed, subtle changes began to appear. Amelia wrote of feeling watched, studied, as if she were a specimen under glass rather than a woman being courted. She described conversations with Dorian that felt more like examinations than exchanges, moments when his attention felt possessive rather than caring. And gradually the wonder in her writing began to be replaced by something that looked increasingly like anxiety. "I love him," one entry read, dated several months into her stay. "I love him with a passion that frightens me in its intensity." But I'm beginning to wonder if what he feels for me is love or ownership. He speaks of protecting me, of keeping me safe from a world that would corrupt or harm me, but sometimes his protection feels like a beautiful prison. Emma looked up to find Dorian watching her, with an expression of such pain that she felt her heart ache for him. "She was right, wasn't she?" she said softly. "So you did try to keep her like a treasure in a vault." "I thought I was loving her," Dorian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was giving her everything she could possibly want. Beauty, luxury, devoted attention. I didn't understand that in trying to protect her from the world, I was also cutting her off from it." Emma continued reading, and the journal entries became increasingly disturbing. Amelia wrote of feeling isolated, of missing the simple human connections she had known before coming to Ravencroft Manor. She described Dorian's growing jealousy of anyone else who claimed her attention, servants who were dismissed for speaking too familiarly with her, tradespeople who were banned from the estate after making her laugh, even Mrs. Ashford, who was reprimanded for showing Amelia too much maternal affection. "He says he wants me to be happy," one entry read, "but he only wants me to be happy with him, through him, because of him. He cannot bear the thought that I might find joy in anything that doesn't originate with his love for me." "My God," Emma breathed, looking up at Dorian with new understanding. "You are suffocating her." "Yes." The admission seemed to tear something loose inside him, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure cracked completely. "I was so afraid of losing her that I tried to make myself her entire world. I thought if I could give her everything she needed, if I could be everything she wanted, then she would never have reason to leave me." "But that's not love," Emma said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. That's like trying to love a bird by keeping it in a golden cage." "I know that now." Dorian moved to one of the windows, staring out at the lake with eyes that seemed to see nothing. "But at the time I told myself I was protecting her, cherishing her, showing her how precious she was to me. I didn't realize I was slowly destroying the very spirit that had drawn me to her in the first place." Emma turned to the final entries in the journal and found herself reading what amounted to a woman's desperate plan for escape. Amelia had begun documenting Dorian's behavior with the systematic care of someone building a case, recording instances of his possessiveness, his attempts to control her interactions with others, his growing inability to tolerate any sign of independence on her part. "I cannot breathe here anymore," one of the last entries read. "The walls of this beautiful prison are closing in on me, and I can feel myself disappearing piece by piece. He loves me, I know he does, but he loves me like a collector loves a rare painting. He wants to possess me, display me, keep me perfect and unchanged forever. He doesn't understand that love means allowing the beloved to grow, to change, to become more than they were when the love began." The final entry was dated just 3 days before Amelia's disappearance, and it consisted of only a few lines. "I have made my choice. I will not allow his love to erase me completely. If I stay, I will become nothing more than a reflection of his desires, a beautiful shell with no soul of my own. I pray that someday he will understand that I am leaving, not because I don't love him, but because I love myself too much to let anyone, even someone I adore, make me disappear." Emma closed the journal with hands that trembled slightly, feeling as if she had just witnessed a tragedy in slow motion. She understood now why Dorian carried such guilt about Amelia's departure, why he had spoken of love and obsession as if they were the same thing. In trying to love her completely, he had nearly destroyed her completely. She was brave, Emma said finally, setting the journal back on the desk with reverent care, to recognize what was happening and have the strength to leave. "She was braver than I was," Dorian replied. "I was too much of a coward to admit what I was doing to her until it was too late." Emma moved through the rest of Amelia's rooms, a bedroom decorated in soft blues and whites, a small library filled with books of poetry and philosophy, a dressing room where elegant gowns still hung like ghosts of happier times. In each space, she could feel the presence of a woman who had struggled to maintain her identity in the face of overwhelming love, who had fought to remain herself even as the man she loved tried to reshape her into his ideal. But it was in the bedroom that Emma found the most telling evidence of Amelia's state of mind during her final days at Ravencroft Manor. Hidden behind a loose board in the window seat, she discovered a collection of letters that Amelia had written, but never sent. Letters to the sister she had left behind, to friends from her former life, to the world beyond Ravencroft Manor that she was no longer allowed to contact. "I dream of walking down a street in London and choosing which shop to enter," one letter read. "I dream of striking up a conversation with a stranger in a tea room. I dream of making a decision, any decision, without having to consider how it will affect his feelings, his plans, his vision of who I should be." Emma felt tears prick her eyes as she read letter after letter, filled with longing for the simple freedoms that most people took for granted. Amelia hadn't been ungrateful for the luxury and beauty of her life at Ravencroft Manor. She had simply been slowly starving for autonomy, for the right to exist as herself, rather than as an extension of Dorian's love. "She tried to tell you, didn't she?" Emma said, returning the letters to their hiding place and turning to face Dorian. "She tried to explain what she needed." "She did." Dorian's voice was rough with emotion. "But I couldn't hear her. Every time she asked for more independence, I interpreted it as criticism of my love for her. Every time she expressed a desire to see the world beyond these walls, I heard it as dissatisfaction with what I was providing. I was so focused on giving her everything I thought she should want that I completely ignored what she actually needed." They moved through the remainder of the East Wing in silence, and Emma began to understand the full scope of what Dorian had created for Amelia. There was a music room with a piano that was clearly superior to the one in the main house, a conservatory filled with exotic plants and flowers that must have cost a fortune to maintain, a studio equipped with the finest art supplies money could buy. Every room was a temple to luxury and beauty, designed to provide every possible pleasure and comfort. And yet, Emma realized, they were also designed to keep their occupant contentedly isolated from the outside world. The windows, while large and beautifully appointed, looked out only onto the estate's private grounds. The telephone, which Emma noticed was present in other parts of the manor, was absent from this wing entirely. Even the books in the library had been carefully chosen, poetry and philosophy and art, but nothing that might encourage thoughts of the wider world beyond Ravencroft Manor's borders. "It's beautiful," Emma said as they completed their tour and stood once again in Amelia's sitting room. "And terrible." "Yes," Dorian's smile was sad and self-aware. "I created the most beautiful prison in the world, and then wondered why my captive wasn't grateful for her golden chains." Emma studied his face, seeing the genuine remorse and hard-won understanding written in every line. This was not a man who was proud of what he had done, or who was likely to repeat the same mistakes. This was a man who had been forced to confront the destructive potential of his own love and had been changed by that confrontation. "And now?" she asked softly. "What would you do differently?" Dorian met her eyes, and Emma saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before, a humility, a willingness to be vulnerable, that spoke of real transformation. "I would love you without trying to own you," he said. "I would cherish your independence rather than trying to limit it. I would encourage you to grow and change and become whoever you're meant to be, even if that person is someone I never expected you to become." "Even if I chose to leave?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Emma watched Dorian's face carefully, seeing the pain that the possibility caused him, but also the resolution that followed it. "Even then," he said firmly, "because real love isn't about keeping someone. It's about wanting their happiness even when their happiness doesn't include you." Emma felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of fears she hadn't even realized she was carrying. This was the answer she had needed to hear, the assurance that her choice to love him would be freely given and freely maintained. He wasn't offering her a beautiful prison. He was offering her a partnership with someone who had learned the hard way that love without freedom wasn't love at all. They made their way back to the main house in contemplative silence, but when they reached the entrance hall, Dorian caught her hand, his fingers warm and slightly rough against her palm. "There's one more thing you need to see," he said. "One more part of the truth about what happened with Amelia." He led her not upstairs but down, through a door Emma had never noticed before that opened onto stone steps leading into the depths of the manor. The air grew cooler as they descended, and Emma could hear the sound of water running somewhere in the darkness ahead. "The cellars," Dorian explained, producing a torch from a bracket on the wall and lighting it with modern efficiency. The original foundation of the manor, built directly onto the bedrock. There are natural springs here that feed the lake, and caverns that extend back into the fell itself. The underground spaces were far more extensive than Emma had imagined. Corridors carved from living rock stretched away into darkness, and chambers opened off the main passage, like rooms in some ancient palace. But it was the largest chamber that took Emma's breath away, a vast space with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows, and walls covered with what appeared to be murals painted directly onto the stone. "My God," Emma whispered, raising her torch to better illuminate the artwork. "What is this place?" "A monument to obsession," Dorian said, his voice echoing strangely in the cavernous space. "I painted these during the months after Amelia left, when I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think of anything but getting her back." Emma moved closer to the walls, and her breath caught as she realized what she was seeing. The murals depicted a woman who was clearly Amelia, beautiful, ethereal, perfect in every detail. But they showed her not as she had been in life, but as some idealized vision of femininity and grace. In the paintings, Amelia was always alone, always serene, always gazing adoringly at some unseen presence. She was depicted as a goddess, a muse, a perfect creature existing solely for the pleasure and inspiration of whoever might worship her. "You painted her as you wanted her to be," Emma said, understanding flooding through her. "Not as she was." "Exactly," Dorian's voice was rough with shame. "Even after she left, even after I had read her journals and understood what I had done to her, I couldn't stop trying to recreate her according to my own vision. I spent months down here painting these images, telling myself I was honoring her memory, when what I was really doing was perpetuating the same fantasy that had driven her away." Emma studied the murals more carefully, noting details that made her skin crawl with their implications. In every image, Amelia was passive, decorative, existing only in relation to the love that surrounded her. There was no sense of her as an individual with her own thoughts, desires, and agency. She had been transformed into a symbol rather than celebrated as a person. "When did you stop?" Emma asked. "The night I realized I was doing it again with you." Dorian moved to stand beside her, both of them staring up at a particularly elaborate mural that showed Amelia surrounded by roses, her hands positioned as if in prayer. "The night you challenged me about Amelia's letter, when you demanded to know the truth about what had happened to her. I came down here afterward, and I saw these paintings with new eyes. I saw what I had been in danger of doing to you." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground air. "You were going to try to make me into another version of her." "Not consciously, but yes, I think I was. The same patterns, the same instincts, the same desire to create rather than discover the woman I was falling in love with." Dorian turned to face her, and in the flickering torchlight, his face looked haggard with self-recrimination. "That's when I knew I had to tell you everything, when I realized that the only way to love you properly was to give you the power to reject that love if you chose to." They stood in silence for several minutes, surrounded by the monuments to Dorian's obsession, and Emma felt the full weight of the choice she was being asked to make. She could see now exactly what loving him would mean, not just the passion and devotion he offered, but the constant vigilance required to maintain her own identity in the face of such overwhelming attention. She would have to be strong enough to resist his impulses to protect and possess, wise enough to recognize when his love was becoming destructive, brave enough to leave if he ever again tried to turn her into a beautiful object, rather than cherish her as a complex human being. It was a daunting prospect. Most women would find it terrifying, but as Emma looked at the murals surrounding them, she felt not fear but a strange sense of confidence. She was not Amelia, and this was not the same situation that Amelia had faced. Dorian had learned from his mistakes, had been changed by them in fundamental ways, and Emma herself was stronger than she had ever imagined, more capable of standing her ground and demanding what she needed. "I want to see the rest," Emma said finally. "There is no more," Dorian replied, confusion evident in his voice. "This is all of it, all the truth about what I was, what I did, what I'm capable of doing again if I'm not careful." Emma shook her head, stepping closer to him in the flickering light. "I want to see who you are now, not who you were with Amelia, but who you've become since then. I want to see the man who painted these murals and then had the courage to show them to me, to let me see the worst of his nature because, He loved me enough to give me an honest choice. Emma, I want to see the man who keeps Amelia's rooms exactly as she left them, not as a shrine to his obsession, but as a reminder of the lessons he learned from losing her. I want to see the man who brought me to this place and told me these stories, even though they might make me run away from him. Dorian stared at her in the torchlight, and Emma could see hope and fear warring in his dark eyes. And what do you see when you look at that man? Emma reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw, the sharp cheekbones that gave him such aristocratic beauty. But more than his physical appeal, she was drawn to the vulnerability he was showing her, the willingness to be known completely, even at the risk of rejection. I see a man who is brave enough to love someone without trying to change them, she said softly. I see a man who has learned that true love means wanting your beloved's happiness, even when it doesn't serve your own desires. I see a man who would let me go if I asked him to, which is exactly why I don't want to go. You're sure? Dorian's voice was barely above a whisper. You understand what you're choosing? The kind of intensity you'd be taking on? Emma smiled, feeling more certain of herself than she ever had in her life. I understand that you'll love me with a passion that could consume both of us if we're not careful. I understand that I'll have to be strong enough to maintain my own identity in the face of that love. I understand that there will be times when I'll need to fight for my independence, and times when you'll need to fight your own instincts to possess rather than cherish. And you're willing to take those risks? I'm willing to take those risks with you, Emma corrected, because I've seen who you become when you love someone, and I've also seen who you become when you lose them. I've seen your capacity for obsession, but I've also seen your capacity for growth and change, and I choose to trust in your ability to love me better than you loved her. Dorian closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. I don't deserve you. Maybe not, Emma agreed, her smile widening, but you're going to try to every day for the rest of our lives. And that's all anyone can ask for, the promise that someone will keep trying to be worthy of the love they've been given. In the depths of Ravenscroft Manor, surrounded by the monuments to a love that had failed because it tried to possess instead of liberate, Emma made her choice, not in ignorance or naivety, but with full knowledge of the risks and challenges that lay ahead. She chose to love a man who was capable of obsession because she was strong enough to resist being consumed by it. She chose to trust in his growth and her own strength, to believe that together they could create something better than what had come before. When Dorian kissed her, there in the torchlit cavern beneath his ancestral home, Emma felt not the surrender of her independence, but the claiming of her power. She was not Amelia, and this was not the same story. This was something new, something born of honesty and choice and the hard-won wisdom that comes from facing the truth about yourself and deciding to be better. As they made their way back to the surface, hand in hand in the growing darkness, Emma felt the last of her old life falling away. Tomorrow, she would write to her grandmother, telling her that she was safe and happy and had found a love worth the risks it entailed. Tomorrow she would begin the work of building a life with a man who would love her fiercely but freely, completely but without possession. But tonight she was simply Emma Hartwell, a woman who had looked into the depths of love's potential for both creation and destruction, and had chosen to trust in her own strength to make it into something beautiful. The choice was made. The education was complete. And the real story, their story, was just beginning. The weeks that followed Emma's choice in the underground chambers of Ravenscroft Manor passed like the pages of a book being written in real time, each day bringing new discoveries about what it meant to love and be loved by someone who understood both passion and restraint. But if Emma had expected their relationship to simply fall into the patterns of fairy tale romance, now that they had declared themselves to each other, she quickly learned that real love, the kind built on honesty and mutual respect, required constant attention, negotiation, and the willingness to confront difficult truths about oneself. The first test came just 3 days after that transformative night in the caves. Emma woke to find Dorian already gone from the breakfast table, and Mrs. Ashford's explanation that he had business to attend to in London struck her as oddly evasive. When pressed for details, the housekeeper could only say that Mr. Blackwood had left very early and had not specified when he would return. In her former life, Emma would have accepted such an explanation without question, trusting that the man's affairs were none of her concern. But the woman she had become at Ravenscroft Manor, confident, empowered, unwilling to be shut out of important decisions, felt a flare of something that was part anger, part hurt, and part recognition of a pattern that felt dangerously familiar. She found Dorian's note in the library, propped against the book she had been reading the night before. The handwriting was hurried, unlike his usual careful script, and the words were brief to the point of curtness. "Business emergency requires my immediate attention in London. Will return as soon as possible. Make yourself at home. D'accord." Emma stared at the note for several long minutes, feeling the first real test of the understanding they had reached in the underground chambers. Was this the beginning of the same patterns that had destroyed his relationship with Amelia? The careful control of information, the exclusion from important aspects of his life, the expectation that she would simply wait patiently for his return without question or complaint. Or was it simply what it appeared to be, an unexpected business crisis that required his immediate attention? The old Emma would have spent the day in anxious uncertainty, wondering what she had done wrong, whether his sudden departure was somehow her fault. But the new Emma, the woman who had looked into the depths of obsessive love and chosen to trust in her own strength, decided to act rather than simply react. She found Mrs. Ashford in the kitchen, supervising the preparation of the day's meals with her usual efficient calm. "Mrs. Ashford," Emma said, her voice carrying a note of authority that surprised them both. "I need to know exactly why Mr. Blackwood left so suddenly, and I need to know now." The housekeeper's eyebrows rose slightly, but she dismissed the kitchen staff with a gesture and turned to face Emma with an expression that was part surprise, part approval. "I'm not sure it's my place to—" Mrs. Ashford began. "It is absolutely your place," Emma interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. "I'm not asking for gossip or secrets. I'm asking for information that affects my life and my relationship with Mr. Blackwood, and I'm asking as someone who has every right to know what's happening in the house where she lives and with the man she loves." Mrs. Ashford studied Emma's face for a long moment, and Emma could see the older woman reassessing her, recognizing the change that had taken place over the past weeks. "There was a telegram early this morning," Mrs. Ashford said finally, "from Mr. Blackwood's business partner in London. Something about irregularities in the accounts of one of their properties, and accusations of impropriety that could affect the entire company. Mr. Blackwood left immediately to handle the situation personally." Emma felt a mix of relief and frustration. Relief that Dorian's departure was indeed related to legitimate business concerns, rather than an attempt to control or exclude her. Frustration that he had felt the need to handle it alone, without even discussing the situation with her. "How long has he been gone on business trips like this during my time here?" Emma asked. "This is the first time he's left the estate since you arrived," Mrs. Ashford replied. "In fact, this is the first time he's left Ravenscroft Manor for any reason in over 6 months. Emma felt her heart soften slightly. Whatever his reasons for leaving so abruptly, it wasn't part of a pattern of abandonment or control. But that didn't change the fact that his method of handling the crisis, the secretive departure, the curt note, the assumption that she would simply accept his absence without explanation, felt wrong. "Mrs. Ashford," Emma said carefully, "do you know how Mr. Blackwood handled similar situations when Miss Amelia was here?" The housekeeper's expression grew thoughtful, and Emma could see her weighing her words carefully. "Mr. Blackwood rarely left the estate during Miss Amelia's time here. When business required his attention, he conducted it through telegrams and correspondence, rather than traveling himself. He was very reluctant to leave her alone. The implication was clear. With Amelia, Dorian had been so possessive that he had refused to leave her even for legitimate business reasons. With Emma, he was perhaps overcorrecting, trying so hard to avoid the appearance of possessiveness that he was swinging too far in the opposite direction. Emma spent the rest of the day walking the grounds of Ravenscroft Manor, thinking about the complexities of loving someone who was still learning how to love properly. By evening, she had reached a decision that both thrilled and terrified her with its audacity. She would go to London, not to chase after Dorian or to check up on him like a jealous lover, but to demonstrate that she was his partner in all things, including the business crises that threatened their shared future. If he was facing accusations that could destroy the foundation of his wealth and position, then she would face them with him. If he was in trouble, she would help him find solutions. If he was trying to protect her from the uglier realities of his world, she would show him that she was strong enough to handle whatever challenges arose. Mrs. Ashford was initially resistant to the idea of Emma traveling to London alone, but when Emma explained her reasoning, the older woman's objections gave way to what looked suspiciously like pride. "It's not what Miss Amelia would have done," Mrs. Ashford said, as she helped Emma pack a small traveling case. "Miss Amelia would have waited here, growing more anxious with each passing hour, until Mr. Blackwood returned to reassure her." "I'm not Miss Amelia," Emma replied, selecting a traveling dress in deep blue wool that she felt conveyed both elegance and determination. "And Mr. Blackwood needs to learn that I'm not someone who can be protected from the realities of his life." The journey to London by train was Emma's first time traveling alone, and she found the experience both exhilarating and daunting. The world beyond Ravenscroft Manor was larger, louder, more chaotic than she had remembered from her sheltered upbringing. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, Emma felt energized by the noise and movement, by the sense of possibility that seemed to pulse through the very air of the city. Finding Dorian proved easier than she had expected. Mrs. Ashford had provided her with the address of his London office, and a telegram sent ahead had ensured that his business partner, a distinguished gentleman named Mr. Charles Westbrook, was expecting her arrival. "Miss Hartwell," Mr. Westbrook said, rising from behind an enormous desk in an office that spoke of old money and older traditions. "What an unexpected pleasure. I must say, Dorian didn't mention that you might be joining him in London." "He doesn't know I'm here," Emma replied, accepting the chair he offered, with a confidence that felt natural despite the extraordinary circumstances. "I came because I felt he shouldn't have to face whatever crisis you're dealing with alone." Mr. Westbrook's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "How very modern of you. So I must say it's quite different from how these situations have been handled in the past." "I'm not interested in how things have been handled in the past," Emma said firmly. "I'm interested in how they're going to be handled now. Can you tell me exactly what accusations have been made and what evidence exists to support them?" For the next hour, Mr. Westbrook explained the complex situation that had brought Dorian to London. One of their hotel properties, a grand establishment in Edinburgh, was being investigated for financial irregularities. A former employee had accused the management of skimming profits and manipulating the books, and the accusations had reached the attention of authorities who were threatening a full investigation that could implicate the entire hotel chain. "The accusations are baseless," Mr. Westbrook assured Emma. "Our books are impeccable," and the former employee in question was dismissed for his own improprieties. But in business, the appearance of impropriety can be as damaging as actual wrongdoing. "Dorian has gone to Edinburgh personally to meet with the authorities and provide whatever documentation they require. And you're confident the investigation will vindicate him?" "Completely. Dorian runs his business with the same attention to detail and ethical standards that he applies to everything else in his life. But the process could take weeks, and the negative publicity could damage our reputation regardless of the outcome." Emma felt a surge of protective anger on Dorian's behalf, followed immediately by a determination to help in whatever way she could. "What can be done to speed the process? Is there anything that would demonstrate Mr. Blackwood's integrity more convincingly than simply providing documents?" Mr. Westbrook studied her with new interest. "Actually, there might be. The investigation is being led by a Scottish magistrate named Lord Pemberton, who is known to be traditional in his views. He places great value on character references from people of unquestioned reputation. If someone of sufficient social standing were to vouch for Dorian's integrity, someone like the daughter of Alexander Ravenscroft, perhaps," Emma suggested, understanding beginning to dawn. "Precisely. Your father's reputation for ethical business practices was legendary, and his endorsement of his daughter's chosen partner would carry considerable weight with someone like Lord Pemberton." Emma felt pieces clicking into place in her mind. "Where is the investigation taking place?" "Edinburgh. Dorian is staying at the Caledonian Hotel while he meets with the authorities. Then that's where I need to be, Emma said, rising from her chair with decision. Can you arrange for me to travel to Edinburgh on the next available train? Mr. Westbrook looked at her with something approaching awe. Miss Hartwell, are you quite certain? This is not a pleasant situation, and there's no guarantee that your intervention will be welcome or effective. Emma smiled, feeling the full weight of her transformation from the sheltered girl who had left Little Thornwick to the confident woman she had become. Mr. Westbrook, 3 weeks ago I would have agreed with you, but I'm not the same person I was 3 weeks ago. I'm someone who believes that love means standing beside the person you care about when they face their worst moments, not waiting safely at home while they fight their battles alone. The journey to Edinburgh took the better part of a day, and Emma used the time to prepare for what she knew would be a difficult conversation with Dorian. He would be angry that she had come, she was certain of that. He would see her presence as evidence that he had failed to protect her from the unpleasantness of his business troubles. He might even interpret her arrival as a lack of trust in his ability to handle the situation himself. But Emma was prepared for his anger because she finally understood what Amelia had never been able to make him understand. That real partnership meant sharing both the joys and the burdens of life together. It meant being strong enough to support each other through difficulties rather than hiding those difficulties out of a misguided desire to protect. She found Dorian in the hotel's drawing room, looking more haggard than she had ever seen him. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that spoke of hours spent running his hands through it in frustration. He was staring into the fire with an expression of such weariness that Emma's heart ached for him. "You look terrible," she said by way of announcement, settling into the chair beside his without invitation. Dorian's head snapped up, his dark eyes widening with shock that quickly gave way to something that looked like panic. "Emma, what in God's name are you doing here? How did you even know where to find me?" "Mrs. Ashford told me about the telegram. Mr. Westbrook explained the situation and I took the train," Emma replied calmly. "As for what I'm doing here, I'm being your partner. Something I can't do if you insist on handling every crisis alone." "This isn't your problem," Dorian said, his voice tight with the kind of control that Emma recognized as barely contained emotion. "These accusations, this investigation, none of it should touch you. I left to handle it so that you wouldn't have to deal with the ugliness of it. And in doing so, you made exactly the same mistake you made with Amelia," Emma said, her voice gentle but implacable. "You decided what I could and couldn't handle without bothering to ask me what I wanted. You chose protection over partnership just like before." Dorian's face went pale, and Emma could see the truth of her words hitting him like a physical blow. "I was trying to spare you." "I don't want to be spared," Emma interrupted. "I want to be included. I want to know when you're facing difficulties so that I can help you face them. I want to be the person you turn to when things go wrong, not the person you hide things from to keep them safe." "The accusations could destroy everything," Dorian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My reputation, my business, everything I've built. I couldn't bear for that to touch you." Emma reached across the space between their chairs and took his hands in hers, feeling the tension in his muscles, the way his fingers trembled slightly against her palms. "Then let me help you make sure it doesn't. Let me be your ally instead of your responsibility." She explained what Mr. Westbrook had told her about Lord Pemberton's character and the weight that a character reference from Alexander Ravencroft's daughter might carry. She outlined her plan to request a meeting with the magistrate, to present herself as someone who had chosen to link her future with Dorian's based on her complete confidence in his integrity. "You would do that?" Dorian asked, his voice filled with wonder. "You would stake your own reputation on mine?" "I would stake everything on you," Emma replied without hesitation, "because I know who you are. Not just the man who made mistakes with Amelia, but the man who learned from those mistakes. I know your character, your honor, your capacity for growth and change, and I trust that completely." The meeting with Lord Pemberton took place the following morning in his chambers, an imposing room lined with law books and portraits of stern-faced judges. The magistrate was exactly what Emma had expected: elderly, conservative, possessed of the kind of old-fashioned values that placed great importance on family reputation and social standing. "Miss Hartwell," he said, rising courteously as she was shown into his chambers, "I understand you wish to speak with me regarding the investigation into Mr. Blackwood's business practices." "Yes." "Your lordship," Emma replied, settling into the chair across from his desk with the poise she had developed during her weeks at Ravencroft Manor. "I understand that questions have been raised about Mr. Blackwood's integrity, and I felt it was important that you hear from someone who knows his character intimately." Lord Pemberton leaned back in his chair, his weathered face showing polite interest. "And what is your relationship to Mr. Blackwood, if you don't mind my asking?" "I am the woman he intends to marry," Emma said, the words coming out with a confidence that surprised even her. "I am also the daughter of Alexander Ravencroft, whose business dealings with Mr. Blackwood spanned nearly a decade." The magistrate's eyebrows rose slightly. "Alexander Ravencroft's daughter? I was not aware that Mr. Ravencroft had living family." Emma spent the next hour telling Lord Pemberton the carefully edited story of her background and her relationship with Dorian. She spoke of her father's trust in his business partner, of the provisions he had made for her care and education, of the month she had spent at Ravencroft Manor, observing Dorian's character and business practices firsthand. "Your lordship," Emma said as the interview drew to a close, "I am not a naive young woman who has been swept off her feet by a charming scoundrel. I am someone who has had the opportunity to examine Mr. Blackwood's character thoroughly, to observe how he treats those who depend on him, to see how he conducts his business affairs. My father trusted him enough to name him as my guardian and the executor of his estate. I trust him enough to bind my future to his." Lord Pemberton was quiet for several minutes after Emma finished speaking, and she could see him weighing her words against whatever preconceptions he might have had about the case. "Miss Hartwell," he said finally, "character references carry great weight with me, particularly when they come from someone whose own reputation is beyond question. Your father was known throughout Scotland for his integrity and ethical business practices. If he trusted Mr. Blackwood, and if you, having had the opportunity to know Mr. Blackwood intimately, are willing to stake your reputation on his, then I am inclined to view these accusations with considerable skepticism. Thank you, your lordship. I hope that when you review the evidence Mr. Blackwood has provided, you'll find it supports the confidence that both my father and I have placed in him." "I'm certain I will," Lord Pemberton replied. "In fact, having spoken with you, I see no need to prolong this investigation unnecessarily. If Mr. Blackwood's books are in order, and I have no reason to doubt that they are, then this matter can be resolved quickly and quietly." When Emma emerged from the magistrate's chambers, she found Dorian waiting in the corridor outside, his face a mask of anxiety and hope. Without a word, she walked into his arms, feeling them close around her with a desperation that spoke of hours spent fearing the worst. "How did it go?" he whispered against her hair. "Lord Pemberton is convinced of your innocence," Emma replied, pulling back to meet his eyes. "He's going to expedite the review of your documentation, and he expects to dismiss the charges within the week." Dorian's knees seemed to give way slightly, and he sank into one of the chairs that lined the corridor, pulling Emma down beside him. "I can't believe you did that. I can't believe you came here, put yourself at risk for me." "That's what partnership means," Emma said simply. "That's what love means. Not protecting each other from every difficulty, but facing difficulties together." "I'm sorry," Dorian said, his voice rough with emotion. "You were right. I was making the same mistakes I made with Amelia. I was so afraid of repeating my past errors that I swung too far in the opposite direction." "We're both learning," Emma replied, taking his hand and intertwining their fingers. "The important thing is that we're learning together." They returned to London that evening, and then to Ravencroft Manor the following day. But the journey gave them time to talk in a way they never had before, not as teacher and student, not as seducer and seduced, but as equal partners working to build something together. "I want you to be involved in my business affairs from now on," Dorian said, as their train wound through the Lake District toward home. "Not just when there are crises, but in the day-to-day operations. You have a good mind for these things, and you're Alexander Ravencroft's daughter. You have as much right to be involved in the hotel business as I do. Are you offering me a job?" Emma asked, amused. "I'm offering you a partnership. In business and in everything else." Emma felt her heart swell with a happiness that was deeper and more complex than simple romantic joy. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it. Not just love, but respect. Not just passion, but equality. Not just someone who would cherish her, but someone who would challenge her to become her best self. The final week of Emma's mandated 30 days at Ravenscroft Manor passed in a blur of planning and preparation. The inheritance that had brought her there was formally transferred to her control, making her independently wealthy for the first time in her life. But more importantly, she and Dorian spent the time working out the practical details of building a life together, where they would live, how they would manage their business interests, what role Emma would play in the hotel empire she had inherited, half of through her father's bequest. On the last night of her official stay, they walked together through the manor's gardens as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. The temple, where Dorian had first hinted at his dark history, stood serene beside its reflecting pool, no longer a monument to obsession, but simply a beautiful folly in a beautiful garden. "Do you regret it?" Dorian asked as they stood beside the pool, watching the last light fade from the sky. "Coming here? Learning what you've learned about me?" Emma considered the question seriously. 3 weeks ago, she had been a sheltered girl whose greatest adventure was a trip to the village shop. Now she was a confident woman who had travelled alone to Edinburgh to save the reputation of the man she loved. She had seen the worst of what obsessive love could do, and she had chosen to trust in the possibility that love could be better than that. "I regret nothing," she said finally. "Not the pain of learning about Amelia, not the fear of seeing what you were capable of, not even the moments when I wasn't sure I was strong enough for what loving you would require. All of it was necessary to become who I am now. And who are you now?" Emma smiled, feeling the full weight of her transformation settle around her like a cloak woven from her own choices. "I'm someone who knows her own mind and isn't afraid to speak it. I'm someone who can love without losing herself, who can be loved without being diminished. I'm someone who understands that the greatest love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other, but about flawed people choosing to grow together." Dorian pulled her into his arms, and when he kissed her this time, it was not with the desperate hunger of someone trying to possess her, but with the reverent joy of someone who had been given a gift beyond his deserving. "I love you, Emma Hartwell," he whispered against her lips. "Not because you're perfect, but because you're brave enough to love me despite my imperfections." "I love you too," Emma replied. "Not because you're the man you were, but because you're the man you're becoming." 6 months later, Emma stood in the drawing room of Ravenscroft Manor, now officially her home, reading a letter that had arrived in the Morning Post. The handwriting was elegant but unfamiliar, and the return address was from a small town in Scotland she had never heard of. "My dear Emma," the letter began, "I hope you will forgive the liberty of writing to you, but I felt compelled to reach out after hearing of your engagement to Dorian Blackwood. My name is Amelia Thornfield, and I believe you may have heard of me. I was, for a time, a resident of Ravenscroft Manor under circumstances very similar to your own. I write not to dissuade you from your chosen path, but to congratulate you on what I can only assume has been a very different journey than my own. Have heard through mutual acquaintances that you have brought about a transformation in Dorian that I was never able to achieve. Where I failed to help him understand the difference between love and possession, you seem to have succeeded. Where I was not strong enough to maintain my identity, in the face of his overwhelming attention, you have apparently found a way to be loved completely without being consumed entirely. I want you to know that I bear no ill will toward Dorian for what happened between us. He was not a cruel man, merely a man who did not understand how to love properly. If you have taught him to love better, then you have given him a gift that will serve him for the rest of his life. I also want you to know that leaving Ravenscroft Manor, difficult as it was, allowed me to discover who I was capable of becoming on my own. I am now married to a good man who loves me as I am, and I am content in a way I never could have been if I had remained in that beautiful prison. But I suspect that for you, Ravenscroft Manor has never been a prison at all. I suspect you have found a way to transform it into something better, a partnership built on mutual respect rather than one-sided devotion. Wish you every happiness in your marriage and in the life you are building together. May your love be everything that mine was not, freely given, freely received, and strong enough to allow both of you to grow into the best versions of yourselves. With warmest regards, Amelia Thornfield. Emma folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of the writing desk where she kept her most precious correspondence. It felt like a benediction, a blessing from the woman whose story had taught her how to write a different ending to her own. "Good news?" Dorian asked, entering the drawing room with the morning newspapers tucked under his arm. "The best," Emma replied, moving into his arms with the easy familiarity of someone who had never doubted her welcome there. "A letter from Amelia. She wanted to congratulate us on our engagement." Dorian's arms tightened around her slightly. "How is she?" "Happy, married, living the life she chose rather than the life someone else wanted for her." Emma pulled back to meet his eyes. "She seems to think we've done something she wasn't able to do, found a way to love each other without losing ourselves in the process." "And do you think she's right?" Emma considered the question, thinking about the months they had spent learning to be partners as well as lovers, allies as well as romantic interests. They had weathered the crisis in Edinburgh together, had worked side by side to expand the hotel business, had built a relationship that was based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than simple passion. "I think she's right," Emma said finally. "I think we've learned something that takes most people a lifetime to understand, that the best love doesn't try to change the beloved, but creates space for both people to become who they're meant to be." "And who are you meant to be, Emma Blackwood?" Dorian asked, using the name she would officially take in just 2 weeks when they married. Emma smiled, feeling the future spread out before them like a map of undiscovered country. "I'm meant to be your wife, your business partner, your equal in all things. I'm meant to be someone who loves without fear, who trusts without reservation, who builds a life based on choice rather than circumstance. And I'm meant to be the man who deserves that love," Dorian said, his voice soft with wonder at the gift he had been given. "The man who protects without possessing, who cherishes without constraining, who loves you enough to let you be exactly who you choose to be." Outside the drawing room windows, the gardens of Ravenscroft Manor bloomed in all their carefully tended glory, and the lake beyond reflected the morning sky like a mirror of infinite possibility. Inside, 2 people who had learned to love properly held each other in the golden light of a new day, secure in the knowledge that they had found something worth all the risks they had taken to claim it. Emma's education was complete, but her real life, the life she would build with a man who had learned to love her as she deserved to be loved, was just beginning. And for the first time in her 21 years, Emma faced the future without fear, confident in her own strength and in the love that had transformed them both. The girl who had left Little Thornwick was gone, forever, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth and had claimed her own destiny, and the man who had once tried to love by possessing had become someone who understood that the greatest gift he could give his beloved was the freedom to choose him every day anew. Together, they had written a love story worthy of the beautiful, complicated, perfectly imperfect people they had become, and together they would continue writing it for the rest of their lives.